The road to Daravan was not a single road. It was many roads, each one branching from the last like the limbs of a great tree, each one offering a different path through terrain that grew more hostile with every mile. The mountains gave way to foothills, the foothills to rolling steppe, the steppe to a broad, barren plain where the wind blew without interruption from horizons so distant they dissolved into the sky like smoke dissolving into air. And across that plain, 500 riders moved in a formation so tight and so disciplined that from a distance they might have been mistaken for a single, vast creature migrating west with the blind determination of something driven by instinct rather than choice. But it was not instinct that drove them, it was knowledge, the knowledge of what waited in Daravan, the knowledge of what Shahinshah's escape meant for every village and every family and every life that had been shattered by the machinery of a war built on commercial calculation rather than political necessity. The knowledge that time was contracting around them like a fist closing, squeezing out the hours and the minutes, and leaving nothing but the narrow, suffocating present in which every decision had to be made now, every action had to be taken now, every mile had to be crossed now or not at all. Orhan had not slept in 3 days, he no longer noticed. The exhaustion had passed through him like a fever, burning hot and disorienting in its early stages, then settling into a flat, colorless numbness that erased the distinction between waking and sleeping, and left him in a state that was neither but contained elements of both. His body moved automatically, responding to the horse's rhythm, adjusting to the terrain, maintaining balance and posture through reflexes so deeply ingrained that consciousness was unnecessary. His mind, freed from the burden of managing his body, had expanded into a space that was both terrifying and exhilarating, a space where he could see the entire campaign simultaneously, where every piece of intelligence and every tactical consideration existed in a single, unified field of awareness that pulsed with connections and possibilities. He saw the campaign the way a hawk sees the earth from height, not in detail but in pattern, not individual trees but forests, not individual rivers but watersheds, not individual men but forces, movements, trajectories, the invisible geometry of war that determines outcomes long before the first sword is drawn. And what he saw frightened him. Not the prospect of battle. Battle he understood. Battle was chaos organized by will, violence disciplined by purpose, death given meaning by the cause it served. He had faced battle 100 times and would face it 100 more, and each time the fear he felt was not the fear of dying but the fear of failing, of reaching the end of his strength before the end of his task, of falling one step short of the justice he had promised to the people who depended on him. What frightened him was the shape of what he was riding into. Daravan was not a fortress. It was not a military installation defended by soldiers and walls and the conventional mechanisms of armed resistance. Daravan was a city, a living city inhabited by thousands of people who had nothing to do with the war and wanted nothing to do with it. Merchants, craftsmen, farmers who came to sell their produce in the markets, children who played in the streets, women who drew water from the public fountains and hung their washing in the sun. Killil had chosen his base well. He had embedded himself in the civilian population like a parasite in a host, knowing that any military action against him would inevitably harm the people around him, and knowing that Orhan, bound by his own principles, would hesitate to inflict that harm. It was the ultimate expression of Killil's philosophy, the conviction that everything and everyone was a commodity to be used, that even the lives of innocent civilians had value not as lives but as shields, as barriers, as the human cost that a principled enemy would refuse to pay. Orhan would have to find a way to extract the parasite without killing the host, and he would have to do it before Shahinshah reached Daravan, and the two of them, puppet and puppeteer, combined their resources and their cunning into a force that would be far more dangerous together than either was alone. Orhan rode beside him, silent as always, his twin blades cleaned and oiled and ready, but there was something in Orhan's silence tonight that was different from the silences of previous nights. It was heavier, more deliberate, the silence of a man who was thinking about something he did not want to think about and could not stop thinking about. Orhan waited. He had learned, over years of riding beside this man, that Orhan's silences were not empty. They were full, overfull, pressurized with thoughts and observations and concerns that would eventually find their way to the surface, the way water finds its way through rock, not by force but by persistence. An hour passed, then another. The plain stretched out before them in the moonlight, flat and featureless, the grass silver-tipped and whispering in the wind. The horses moved at a steady canter, their hooves muffled by the soft earth, their breathing deep and rhythmic and hypnotic. Then Orhan spoke. "You cannot save everyone." The words were quiet, almost gentle. They carried no judgment and no challenge. They were simply a statement of fact, offered by a man who had spent his life watching other men try to do the impossible and had learned to recognize the particular expression that appeared on their faces when they realized they could not. Orhan did not respond immediately. He let the words settle into him the way rain settles into dry earth, absorbing slowly, penetrating deeply, reaching places that the noise and urgency of the campaign had sealed off from examination. "I know," he said at last. Orhan waited. "I know I cannot save everyone. I have always known it. I knew it when we buried the first soldier who fell under my command. I knew it when I stood on the ridge and looked down at the bodies of men who had died because I ordered a charge instead of a retreat. I knew it at the warehouse when we arrived too late to save the outer buildings and the grain inside them burned while we stood and watched." He paused. "But knowing it does not absolve me from trying. If I accept that some people will be lost, if I make that acceptance the foundation of my decisions, then I have already decided who matters and who does not. And I have no right to make that decision. Only Allah has that right. My obligation is to try with everything I have, to try until there is nothing left to try with, and then to accept the outcome, whatever it is, with the knowledge that I held nothing back." Orhan considered this for a long time. The plain rolled beneath them, the stars turned overhead. "Daravan will not be like the fortress or the ridge," he said. "In a battle the lines are clear. Here is the enemy, there is the friend, between them is the space where violence is permitted. In a city there are no lines, the enemy sits in the same street as the innocent, the threat hides behind the face of a neighbor, a sword cannot distinguish between them, an arrow cannot choose." "I will not use arrows," Orhan said. "I will not use swords, not in the city, not among the people." Orhan's eyebrow rose again, that fractional expression that was the closest he ever came to showing surprise. "Then how?" Orhan looked west, toward the horizon, where Daravan waited somewhere beyond the curve of the earth. "Killil is a merchant. His power comes from commerce, not from arms. His guards are mercenaries, men who fight for gold and whose loyalty expires when the gold runs out. His network is built on contracts and debts and mutual obligations that have nothing to do with honor or faith or the causes that bind men like us together." He turned to Orhan. "We will not invade Daravan, we will bankrupt it." The plan that Orhan laid out over the next hour of riding was unlike anything he had attempted before. It was not a military plan. It was an economic one, a strategy designed not to defeat an army but to dismantle a commercial empire piece by piece, contract by contract, until the man at its center was left standing in the ruins of his own creation with nothing to rebuild it with. The first element was information. Altadin Saheb's presentation to the regional council would have included copies of Killil's documents, proof of his involvement in the war, proof of his grain theft, proof of his weapon sales to both sides. If the council acted on those documents, and Orhan believed they would because the council members were themselves victims of Killil's manipulations, they would issue warrants for the seizure of Killil's assets, warrants for the arrest of his agents. Warrants that would give legal authority to what Orhan intended to do and transform it from an act of war into an act of justice. The second element was economics. Killil's wealth was not in gold alone. It was in goods, in contracts, in the network of suppliers and buyers and intermediaries who made his trade routes function. If those trade routes were cut, if his suppliers were convinced or compelled to stop supplying, if his buyers were shown evidence of his crimes and persuaded to take their business elsewhere, the economic foundation of his power would crumble. Mustafa's force in the east had already begun this process by cutting Al-Aliadin's supply routes. The warehouse seizure in Ashkara had removed a major asset from Killil's balance sheet. The defection of Jakarta's force had eliminated the military protection that Killil had been counting on in the Western territories. Each blow individually was survivable. Together they constituted a siege, not of walls and gates, but of ledgers and contracts and the invisible architecture of commercial power. The third element was people, not soldiers, people, the citizens of Daravan themselves. Killil had lived among them for years. He had bought their goodwill with charitable donations, with public works, with the carefully cultivated image of a benevolent merchant prince whose wealth was a blessing to the community rather than a curse upon it. He had endowed mosques and built schools and funded festivals, and the people of Daravan had accepted his generosity without questioning its source, because generosity, when it arrives bearing gifts, is rarely interrogated. But the documents that Faladios had recovered would change that. If the people of Daravan learned that Killil's wealth had been built on stolen grain, that the schools he endowed were funded with the proceeds of famine, that the mosques he built were mortared with the suffering of their own countrymen, the goodwill would evaporate, and with it would go the social protection that Killil relied upon, the shield of civilian affection that had made him untouchable. Orhan would send messengers ahead, men and women from the villages that Killil had plundered, people whose faces and stories would carry more weight than any document. They would enter Daravan not as soldiers or spies but as witnesses, as survivors, as the living proof of what Killil's commerce had cost. They would speak in the markets and the mosques and the public squares, and they would tell their stories, and the people of Daravan would listen, because the truth, spoken by those who have suffered it, has a power that no gold can buy and no lie can withstand. It will take time, Palladios said. He had been listening to the plan with the attentive, evaluative expression of a man who was simultaneously admiring the strategy and identifying its weaknesses. Time we may not have. If Şahinşah reaches Daravan before the people turn against Kilal, he will use the mercenary guard to secure the city and establish a defensive position that we would need 10 times our current force to assault. I know, Orhan said. Then we need to delay Şahinşah. Yes, sir. Tarhin spoke. I will do it. Both Orhan and Palladios turned to look at him. Tarhin sat his horse with the particular stillness that he adopted when he had made a decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up with it. Give me 20 riders, the best we have. I will find Şahinşah's trail and ride him down. I will not engage him directly. I do not need to. I will harry him, shadow him, appear on his flanks and his rear, burn the bridges ahead of him, poison the wells along his route, make every mile he rides cost him an hour, make every night he spends in camp a night without sleep, make every step he takes toward Daravan feel like a step into quicksand. He looked at Orhan. I can give you 3 days, perhaps 4, enough time for your messengers to reach Daravan, enough time for the people to hear the truth, enough time for Kilal's world to begin falling apart before Şahinşah arrives to hold it together. Orhan looked at Tarhin. He looked at the man who had been beside him through every battle and every march and every sleepless night of this endless, grinding war. The man who had intercepted arrows meant for his heart and blades meant for his throat. The man whose oath did not expire. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to keep Tarhin at his side, where he had always been, where his presence was as essential as Orhan's own heartbeat. The thought of facing what was coming without Tarhin beside him was like the thought of breathing without air, theoretically possible but practically devastating. But Tarhin was right. Delaying Şahinşah was essential, and there was no one else who could do it. No one else who had Tarhin's combination of combat skill and tactical instinct, and the sheer, unyielding stubbornness required to ride down a fleeing enemy and harass him into paralysis without ever committing to a full engagement. Go, Orhan said. The word tasted like ashes in his mouth. Take your 20 riders, give me the days I need, and come back to me alive. Tarhin, that is not a request. That is the one order I will ever give you that I expect you to obey without question. Tarhin almost smiled. The expression was so rare on his face that it was startling, like seeing a familiar landscape suddenly illuminated by a light that had never fallen on it before. I have obeyed every order you have ever given me, he said, even the ones I thought were foolish. This one at least I agree with. He turned his horse and rode back through the column, selecting his 20 riders with the practiced eye of a man who knows exactly what he needs and where to find it. Within minutes he had assembled his force, a compact, lethal group of men who looked like they had been carved from the same material as the landscape itself, hard and spare and capable of surviving anything the world chose to throw at them. Tarhin rode to the head of his small column. He looked back at Orhan one last time. He did not wave, he did not salute, he did not speak. He simply met Orhan's eyes across the distance between them, and in that look was everything that words could not contain. The years of shared struggle, the weight of mutual trust, the unspoken acknowledgement that this might be the last time they saw each other alive. Then Tarhin turned his horse southeast, toward the hills where Şahinşah's trail would be found, and rode into the darkness with his 20 men behind him, and the sound of their hooves diminished and faded and was gone. Orhan sat motionless on his horse for a long time after Tarhin disappeared. The column waited behind him, patient, silent, understanding without being told that their commander needed a moment to absorb what had just happened, a separation that felt like an amputation, the removal of something essential, the sudden, disorienting awareness of absence where presence had been. Then he straightened his back and set his jaw and turned his horse west. We ride, he said, and the column moved. They reached the outskirts of Daravan 2 days later. The city emerged from the plain like a mirage, its minarets and rooftops rising above a haze of dust and cooking smoke that hung over the urban landscape like a translucent veil. It was larger than Orhan had expected, a sprawling collection of neighborhoods and markets and public buildings connected by streets that radiated outward from a central square like the spokes of a wheel. The walls that surrounded it were old and in poor repair, relics of an era when the city had been a frontier outpost rather than a commercial center, their stones cracked and weather-worn, their battlements crumbling, the gates standing open day and night because the city's commerce required the free flow of goods and people, and the walls were regarded as quaint relics rather than functional defenses. Kilal's compound was visible even from a distance. It occupied the northeastern quarter of the city, a complex of warehouses, offices, and residential buildings enclosed by a private wall that was newer and better maintained than the city's own fortifications. The wall was high, perhaps 15 feet, constructed of smooth stone that offered no handholds for climbers. Watchtowers stood at each corner, manned by guards whose armor and weapons were of a quality that suggested professional mercenaries rather than civilian watchmen. Orhan did not approach the city. He halted his column 2 miles from the eastern gate and established a camp in a dry riverbed that provided concealment from observation. The camp was austere, minimal, designed for rapid abandonment if the situation required it. No tents, no campfires, men slept on the ground with their weapons beside them, their horses tethered to stakes driven into the sandy soil, their ears tuned to the sounds of the surrounding landscape. While the men rested, Orhan sent his messengers. He had selected them carefully, not soldiers, not warriors, people whose faces and voices would carry the weight of authenticity that no official proclamation could match. A woman from one of the Ashkara villages whose children had gone hungry for months while their grain sat in Kilil's warehouse. An old farmer whose livestock had been confiscated by Al-Aliaddin's soldiers and sold to feed Kilil's mercenaries. A young man who had been conscripted into Shahinshah's army and had deserted when he realized that the cause he was fighting for was a fabrication designed to generate profit for a merchant he had never met. These people entered Daravan through different gates at different times, carrying nothing that would identify them as anything other than ordinary travelers. They went to the markets and the tea houses and the mosques, and they began to talk. They told their stories. They showed copies of Kilil's documents to anyone who would look at them. They wept in public, not performatively but genuinely, because the stories they were telling were their own stories, and the grief they expressed was real. The effect was slow at first. Daravan was a commercial city, accustomed to rumors and gossip and the constant low-level hum of information that accompanied the flow of trade. Another story about a merchant's misdeeds was just another thread in the tapestry of urban conversation, noted but not necessarily believed, discussed but not necessarily acted upon. But this story was different. It had documents. It had names and dates and figures that could be verified. It had faces, real faces, faces that bore the marks of real suffering, faces that looked into the eyes of Daravan's comfortable, well-fed citizens and asked without words the question that no comfortable person wants to hear. Did you know? Did you know that the silk on your table was purchased with gold earned from stolen grain? Did you know that the mosque where you pray was built with money that should have fed children who are now dead? Did you know that the man who smiles at you in the market, who gives to charity and speaks at festivals and is praised as a pillar of the community, is the architect of a famine that has killed more people than the war itself? Did you know? The question spread through Daravan like a crack spreading through ice. It moved from the markets to the homes, from the homes to the workshops, from the workshops to the mosques, from the mosques to the seats of local governance where the city's elders and officials gathered to discuss matters of public concern. Within a day, the question was everywhere. Within 2 days, it had become the only thing anyone in Daravan was talking about. Kilil felt it. He could not have avoided feeling it. The change in the city's atmosphere was as palpable as a change in the weather, a shift from warmth to cold, from welcome to suspicion, from the comfortable embrace of a community that had valued him to the chilly regard of a community that was beginning to wonder whether it had been deceived. He responded the way he always responded to threats against his position. He spent money. He sent his agents through the city to distribute arms and make donations to public institutions. He organized a feast in the central square, open to all citizens, with food and entertainment and the calculated generosity that had always been his most effective tool for managing public perception. But this time the tool did not work. The people came to the feast, because free food is free food and hunger does not distinguish between sources, but they came with the documents in their minds and the faces of the witnesses in their memory, and the food tasted different now. It tasted like the grain that had been stolen from villages they had never visited but could no longer ignore. It tasted like the tears of women whose children had gone to bed hungry so that Kilil could go to bed wealthy. It tasted like the truth, which is the one flavor that no amount of seasoning can disguise. Orhan watched from a distance. He had positioned scouts on the hills overlooking the city, men with sharp eyes and sharper memories who reported every change in the city's activity, every movement of Kilil's guards, every shift in the public mood. The reports were encouraging. The tide was turning, but it was turning slowly, and the one thing Orhan did not have was the luxury of patience. Because Turhan's riders had found Shahinshah's trail, the messages came in fragments, carried by relays of scouts who rode between Turhan's harrying force and Orhan's camp with the breathless urgency of men who understood that every hour mattered. Shahinshah was moving west. He was moving fast, faster than Turhan had anticipated, because he had acquired fresh horses somewhere, probably from one of Kilil's hidden supply depots, and his small party of escapees had grown into a column of perhaps 50 as loyalists and mercenaries rallied to his banner. Turhan was doing everything he could. The messages described ambushes on narrow trails, burned bridges over rivers that Şahinşah would have to ford rather than cross, wells contaminated with dead animals and bitter herbs that would sicken but not kill, false trails laid to lead Şahinşah's scouts in the wrong direction. Every trick in Tarhin's considerable repertoire was being employed, and each one cost Şahinşah time. But not enough time. Tarhin's latest message, arriving just before dawn on the second day, was stark. 2 days, perhaps less, he pushes through everything. His desperation makes him faster than my cunning makes him slow. You must be ready. Orhan was ready. He had been ready since before Tarhin left. But ready for what? Ready for a siege he did not have the men to conduct. Ready for an assault on a city he had no wish to damage. Ready for a confrontation with a merchant whose weapons were not swords but contracts and whose armor was not steel but the civilian population he had positioned between himself and harm. He stood on the hill overlooking Daravan as the sun rose on the third day and watched the city come alive. Smoke rose from chimneys. Carts rolled through the gates carrying produce from the surrounding farms. Children ran through the streets, their voices rising in the high, clear sounds of play that are the same in every city, in every country, in every era of human history. It was a beautiful city, a living city. A city that deserved better than to be caught in the crossfire of a war it had not started and did not understand. He made his decision. He would enter Daravan himself, not at the head of an army, not with swords drawn and banners flying, alone or nearly alone. He would take Faladios and Damir Khan and 10 men as personal guard, and he would ride through the gates of Daravan in daylight in the open with nothing to hide and nothing to fear. He would go to Killil, not to fight him, not to arrest him, not to threaten him with the army camped 2 miles from his walls. He would go to speak. Because in the end, after all the battles and the marches and the blood and the fire, it came down to speech. It came down to the human capacity to say true things in dangerous places and to trust that the truth once spoken would do what swords and arrows could not. It would reach hearts. It would change minds. It would create the conditions for a justice that was deeper and more lasting than anything that could be achieved through violence. Faladios objected, strenuously. He pointed out that Killil's mercenary guard numbered at least 200, that the compound was fortified, that entering it with 10 men was not courage but suicide. He used words like reckless and foolish and irresponsible, words he had never used to Orhan before, words that revealed the depth of his concern and the intensity of his objection. Orhan listened. He listened to every word. He respected Faladios as a commander, as a thinker, as a man whose judgment had been proven correct time and again. And when Faladios had finished, Orhan spoke with the quiet certainty of a man who has already made his peace with the consequences of his decision. If I ride into Daravan with an army, Killil becomes a victim. He becomes the merchant who was attacked by a warlord. He becomes the benefactor who was persecuted for his generosity. He becomes the martyr, and martyrs are more dangerous dead than alive, because dead men cannot be questioned and their stories cannot be contradicted. But if I ride into Daravan alone, or nearly so, I become a supplicant. I become a man who trusts the people of this city enough to place himself in their hands. I become the opposite of everything Killil has said about me, the opposite of the warlord, the opposite of the invader, the opposite of the threat that he has used to justify his own power and his own cruelty. He looked at Faladios. I will not give Killil the narrative he needs. I will give the people of Daravan the narrative they deserve. A man who comes not with swords but with truth. A man who asks not for submission but for judgment. A man who trusts them to see what is real and to act on what they see. Faladios closed his eyes. He breathed deeply. When he opened his eyes, the objection was still there, visible in the tightness around his mouth and the furrow between his brows, but it had been subordinated to something larger, something that Faladios had always possessed but rarely displayed, the capacity for faith. Then I go with you, he said, not as a guard, as a witness. Someone needs to survive to tell the story if you do not. Orhan clasped his forearm. We will both survive, and the story will be told by the people of Daravan themselves. They rode into the city at mid-morning. The gates were open, as they always were. The guards who manned them were city guards, not Killil's mercenaries, and they looked at Orhan's small party with the surprised curiosity of men who saw armed riders approaching and expected an army behind them and saw nothing but empty road. Orhan dismounted at the gate and approached the senior guard. I am Orhan Sahib, he said. I have come to speak with Killil. I carry no warrant and no weapon of war. I carry only documents that the people of this city have a right to see. I ask for safe passage to the central square where I will address anyone who wishes to hear what I have to say. The guard stared at him. He had heard the rumors. He had seen the documents that had been circulating through the city. He had heard the stories told by the witnesses from Ashkara and the other villages. And now the man at the center of those stories was standing before him, unarmed except for the sword at his side, asking not for conquest but for an audience. The guard stepped aside. Orhan walked his horse through the streets of Daravan, and the city watched him pass. People emerged from shops and houses, from workshops and market stalls, drawn by the sight of a man whose name had been on every tongue for 2 days. They lined the streets in silence, not hostile, not welcoming, but watchful, evaluating, waiting to see what would happen next. He reached the central square. It was large, paved with stone, surrounded by the city's most important buildings: the mosque, the courthouse, the market hall, the offices of the city's governing council. In the center of the square stood a fountain that had been built by a sultan whose name had been worn away by centuries of weather and was now illegible, a monument to the impermanence of power and the endurance of water. Orhan stopped beside the fountain and dismounted. Faladios dismounted beside him. Damir Khan and the 10 guards formed a loose circle around them, their weapons sheathed, their postures relaxed, their expressions carefully calibrated to project confidence without aggression. The square began to fill. People came from every direction, drawn by word of mouth that spread through the city faster than any messenger could have carried it. Within an hour, the square was packed. Thousands of people pressing against each other, standing on walls and rooftops and the steps of the mosque, craning their necks to see the man who stood beside the fountain and waited for the crowd to settle. When the square was full, and the murmur of voices had subsided to a low, expectant hum, Orhan spoke. He did not shout, he did not declaim. He spoke in a voice that was strong enough to carry across the square but calm enough to suggest that what he was saying was not a performance but a conversation, an exchange between one man and many, conducted with the respect that honest speech demands. People of Daravan, I have not come to your city as a conqueror or a liberator or a judge. I have come as a man who carries a burden that is too heavy for one pair of shoulders and too important to set down. He paused and looked at the faces around him, old faces and young faces, rich faces and poor faces, faces marked by the particular combination of curiosity and skepticism that characterizes people who have been told many things by many men and have learned to trust none of them completely. You know my name, you have heard stories about me, some true, some false, some a mixture of both. I am not here to tell you which stories to believe. I am here to add one more story to the ones you have already heard and to let you decide for yourselves what it means. He reached into the leather case that he carried and withdrew the documents, not the originals, which were too valuable to risk, but copies that had been made with painstaking accuracy by scribes who understood the importance of every word and every number. These documents were taken from the private records of a man you know well, a man who has lived among you for years, a man who has given generously to your mosques, your schools, your public works, a man who is praised as a benefactor and respected as a pillar of your community. He held the documents up. These documents show that the wealth he gave you was built on the suffering of your countrymen. They show that grain stolen from villages in the Ashkara Valley and the Eastern Territories was stored in his warehouses and sold at prices that turned famine into profit. They show that weapons were sold to both sides of a war that has killed thousands, ensuring that the war continued, because continuing war was more profitable than ending it. They show that officials were bribed, commanders were corrupted, and the entire machinery of conflict was maintained and oiled and kept running by a single man's avarice. He lowered the documents. I did not write these documents. They were written by the man himself in his own hand, in his own ledgers, with his own seal. They are his confession, written not in words of guilt but in columns of numbers that tell the same story, a story of wealth extracted from suffering, of power built on exploitation, of a community deceived by its own benefactor. The square was silent. The silence was vast and heavy and filled with the sound of hearts beating and minds working, and the slow, painful process of belief giving way to doubt and doubt giving way to something harder and more demanding than either. Then a voice rose from the crowd, a woman's voice, clear and strong and trembling with an emotion that was too large for the words it chose to express itself through. My son was conscripted into the army that fought the war you describe. He did not come home. If what you say is true, then my son died not for his country but for a merchant's ledger. Is that what you are telling me? Orhan looked at her. She was middle-aged, dressed simply, her face lined with the particular kind of grief that does not fade with time but becomes part of the landscape of the face itself, as permanent as bone. I am telling you what the documents show, he said. I cannot tell you what your son died for because that is between him and Allah, but I can tell you that the war he died in was sustained by a man who profited from every death on both sides, and that the peace that would have saved your son's life was prevented by the same man because peace was bad for business. The woman stared at him. Tears ran down her face, but her expression was not grief, it was rage. The quiet, focused, incandescent rage of a mother who has lost a child and has just been shown the face of the one responsible. She turned and looked toward the northeast, toward the quarter of the city where Killil's compound rose above the surrounding buildings, its walls smooth and high and impervious to the suffering that had paid for them. And one by one, the people around her turned and looked in the same direction. Orhan felt the shift. He felt the moment when the crowd's energy changed from passive reception to active decision, from listening to acting, from audience to participant. It was a moment he had planned for but could not have predicted, because moments like this are not the product of planning. They are the product of truth meeting injustice at a point where the human capacity for tolerance has been exhausted. But he also knew that this moment, if mishandled, could become something terrible. A mob is not a movement. A crowd driven by rage is not the same as a people driven by justice. The difference between the two is leadership, the presence of someone who can channel the energy of the moment into action that is purposeful rather than destructive, targeted rather than indiscriminate, just rather than merely vengeful. He raised his hands. "I understand your anger," he said. "I share it, but I did not come here to start a riot. I came here to start a reckoning. And a reckoning is not a mob with torches. A reckoning is a people who know the truth and demand accountability from those who have wronged them, not with violence, with law, with evidence, with the weight of justice that no wall can withstand and no gold can buy." He pointed toward the courthouse. "Your city has courts, your city has laws, your city has officials whose duty it is to hear evidence and render judgment. Take these documents to them. Present the testimony of the witnesses who have come from the villages. Demand an investigation, demand accountability. And if the investigation confirms what these documents show, demand justice." He paused. "Not my justice, yours, the justice of the people of Daravan, exercised through the institutions that you built and the laws that you live by. That is the justice that will endure. That is the justice that Killil cannot buy or bribe or escape. And that is the justice that will prove to the world and to your own children that you are not a community that can be deceived indefinitely by a generous thief." The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded it. It was not the silence of shock or processing. It was the silence of resolve, the silence of a collective decision being made, not by any individual but by the community itself, a decision that crystallized in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and then became irreversible. The crowd moved, not as a mob, not with torches and weapons and the blind, destructive fury that turns cities into ruins. They moved with purpose. They moved toward the courthouse. They moved with the documents in their hands and the testimony of the witnesses in their ears and the rage of the bereaved mother in their hearts. But they moved within the boundaries that Orhan had drawn, within the structures of law and governance that gave their anger legitimacy and their demands the force of right. Orhan watched them go. He stood beside the fountain in the suddenly empty square and felt the weight of the moment press down on him like a physical thing, enormous and crushing, and yet somehow sustaining, like the weight of the earth itself, which buries and supports and nourishes all at once. Faladios appeared at his side. "You gambled," he said. "Yes, sir. You gambled with your life and the lives of everyone in this city." "Yes, sir." "And you won." Orhan shook his head. "I did not win. The people of Daravan won. They chose the truth over the lie. They chose justice over rage. They chose to be better than the man who deceived them, and that choice was theirs alone. I merely gave them the opportunity to make it." But even as he spoke, even as the crowd flowed toward the courthouse and the machinery of civil justice began to turn, Orhan knew that the story was not over. Killil was still in his compound. His mercenary guard was still at their posts. His gold was still in his vaults. And somewhere to the east, drawing closer with every hour, Şahinşah was riding hard toward Daravan with 50 men and the desperate determination of a man who has lost everything and has nothing left to lose. Orhan's message arrived at noon. It was carried by a rider whose horse had been run nearly to death, a young man whose eyes were wide with the particular combination of exhaustion and urgency that told Orhan everything he needed to know before the message was even delivered. "He has broken through. I could not hold him. He is one day behind me, perhaps less. He rides with 60 men now, more joining as he goes. He will reach Daravan by tomorrow at dawn." Orhan read the message twice. He folded it and placed it inside his armor, next to his heart, next to the place where Faladios's documents rested, next to the accumulated weight of every piece of information and every decision and every prayer that had brought him to this place. He looked west toward the courthouse where the people of Daravan were presenting their case. He looked northeast toward Killil's compound where the merchant sat behind his walls with his mercenaries and his gold and his rapidly diminishing options. He looked east toward the horizon where Şahinşah was approaching like a storm that could not be outrun. And he made his final decision. He would not flee, he would not fortify. He would not hide behind the people of Daravan or use them as shields the way Killil had used them. He would stand in the central square of Daravan in the open in the light, and he would wait for Şahinşah to come. And when Şahinşah arrived, he would offer him the same thing he had offered Jakarta in the defile, the same thing he had offered the people of Daravan in the square, the same thing he had offered every person he had confronted throughout this long and terrible campaign. The truth, because the truth was his weapon, his shield, his fortress, and his faith. It was the one thing that could not be taken from him and the one thing that his enemies could not withstand. It was the thread that connected every battle he had fought and every life he had saved and every prayer he had whispered into the darkness, and it ran through the center of his soul like a river that no drought could dry and no dam could stop. "Send word to the camp," he said to Demir Khan. "Bring the men to Daravan, not to fight, to stand. I want them lining the streets and filling the squares and standing on the walls in the morning when Şahinşah arrives. I want him to see not an army but a people, not swords but faces, not a force to be defeated but a truth to be acknowledged." Demir Khan rode east to deliver the order. Faladios began coordinating with the city's officials to prepare for the morning. Orhan stood beside the fountain in the central square and watched the sun move across the sky, counting the hours that remained between now and the arrival of the man he had been fighting for longer than he could remember. And in the distance, closing fast, riding through the failing light with the desperation of a man chasing the last ember of a dying fire, Şahinşah came. And behind him, somewhere in the hills, still fighting, still harrying, still buying time with cunning and courage, and the stubborn refusal to stop, Turhan rode. And the night deepened, and the stars appeared, and the world held its breath. And the story continued, as stories do, not because anyone commanded it to continue, but because the forces that drove it, the hunger for justice, the need for truth, the ancient, inextinguishable human conviction that the world could be better than it was, would not allow it to stop. Not yet. Not here. Not while there was still one road left to walk, and one battle left to fight, and one truth left to speak in a world that was desperate to hear it. The dawn was coming, and with it the reckoning.
Each man carries what he needs on his horse and nothing more. Reach the narrows before the enemy does and establish positions on both ridges. Demir Khan, you will command the left ridge. Mahmud, the right. Turhan, you will hold the center of the valley with the cavalry as a reserve force, ready to strike when the enemy is committed and cannot withdraw. Turhan said, and if they come in numbers that 500 cannot hold. Orhan said, then you hold them as long as you can and send word to me, and I will come with everything that remains. But you must give me time, Turhan. You must buy me at least 2 days. 2 days to gather the reserves, to arm the recruits, to call in Altadin Saheb from the northern garrisons and Zarkan from the western patrols. Turhan said 2 days. He said it not as a question but as a contract. A binding agreement between a sultan and his sword arm, sealed not with ink but with the understanding that this oath might cost him his life. Orhan said, can you give me that? Turhan said, I will give you that or I will die trying. There is no third option. The room was silent. Then Nasser Celebi, who had been scribbling calculations on a piece of parchment, looked up and said, my sultan, if Turhan takes 500, that leaves us with roughly 300 trained soldiers for the city garrison, plus the recruits. If Şahinşah has sent a diversionary force toward the city while his main army moves through the eastern valleys, we will be dangerously exposed. Orhan said, that is why I need Altadin and Zarkan. Send riders now, tonight, the fastest horses we have. Tell them to abandon their current patrols and march for Bursa with every man they can bring. Tell them this is not a request. This is a command from their sultan, and the penalty for delay is the destruction of everything we have built. Nasser said, it will be done. Khalil said, my sultan, there is another matter, the people. If word spreads that an army is approaching, there will be panic. The markets will close. The roads will clog with refugees. The very chaos of fear will do more damage than the enemy's swords. Orhan considered this. He said, you are right, the people must be informed, but carefully. Khalil, you will address the Friday congregation tomorrow. You will tell them that threats have been identified on our borders. You will remind them that this is the land of Islam, that its defense is the duty of every believer, and that Allah has promised victory to those who stand firm in his cause. Do not minimize the danger. Do not exaggerate it. Speak the truth, because the truth is our strongest weapon and lies are the weapons of men like Şahinşah. Khalil bowed his head. He said, I understand, my sultan. And then Orhan did something that surprised every man in the room. He sat down. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread. He closed his eyes, and he was silent for a long moment. So long that the men began to glance at each other, uncertain, uncomfortable, wondering if they should speak or wait or leave. Then Orhan opened his eyes, and when he spoke his voice was different, quieter, stripped of the authority and command that usually armored it. This was not the Sultan speaking. This was the man beneath the Sultan, the human being who carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders and sometimes, in the darkest hours, felt that weight threatening to crush him. He said, "I want you to know something, all of you. I want you to know that I do not take lightly what I am asking of you. I am asking you to ride into danger. I am asking you to risk your lives. I am asking you to leave your families and your homes and travel toward a place where death is waiting with open arms. I know what this costs. I know because I have paid that cost myself many times, and each time the price was higher than the time before. Each time a piece of me was left on the battlefield that I could never retrieve. So I want you to know that I do not command your sacrifice with a light heart. I command it because I must. Because if we do not stand now, there will be nothing left to stand for. And I would rather die on my feet in a narrow valley, surrounded by my brothers, than live on my knees in a palace that has been emptied of honor." The silence that followed was not the silence of doubt or hesitation. It was the silence of men who had been reminded why they followed this man, not because of his title, not because of his lineage, not because of the wealth or power he commanded, but because of this honesty, this willingness to stand beside them in the fire and burn alongside them if that was what the moment required. Orhan was the first to move. He placed his right hand on his chest over his heart. He said, "My Sultan, my life has been yours since the day you drew me from the battlefield when I was wounded and carried me on your own back to safety. That debt cannot be repaid with words. It can only be repaid with action. I will hold Kara Dera for 2 days. I will hold it for 3. I will hold it until the mountains themselves crumble before I allow a single enemy soldier to pass." Demir Khan placed his hand over his heart. He said, "I ride with Orhan. Where he goes, I go. Where he stands, I stand. This is not duty. This is brotherhood." Mahmud said nothing. He simply nodded. But his nod carried the weight of 1,000 words, because Mahmud's silence was not the silence of a man who has nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who has said everything that matters through his actions and sees no need to repeat himself with his tongue. Tamir Boga shifted his weight. The floor creaked beneath him. He said, "I will prepare the recruits. They are not ready, but they will be readier than they are now. I will drill them through the day and through the night if I must. By the time the enemy reaches our walls, these boys will know which end of the sword to hold and which end to point at the man trying to kill them. That is all I can promise, but it is a promise I will keep." Nasser Celebi straightened his spine. He said, "I will see to the supplies. 40 days of provisions will become 60. I will find a way. I always find a way. It is what I do. It is what Allah put me on this earth to do, to count things and move things and make sure that the men who fight have what they need to keep fighting. And I will do it, or I will die at my desk with a quill in my hand and a ledger open before me, which, if I am being honest, is exactly how I always imagined I would die." Despite everything, despite the weight and the darkness and the knowledge of what was coming, a ghost of a smile crossed Orhan Sahib's face. He said, "Nasser, if you die at your desk, I will personally ensure that your quill is buried with you." Nasser said, "That is all I ask, my Sultan." And then the moment of warmth passed, as such moments always do, carried away by the current of urgency that flowed beneath every word, every glance, every breath in that room. Orhan stood. He said, "Go, all of you, do what must be done. And when this is over, when the enemy has been turned back and the land is secure, we will sit together again in this room and we will remember this night. We will remember it not as the night we were afraid, but as the night we decided to stand." They filed out one by one, Orhan first, moving with purpose toward the barracks to select his 500. Demir Khan beside him, already discussing the logistics of the night march. Mahmud vanishing into the shadows as though he had never been there at all. Tamir Boga striding toward the training grounds, his massive frame silhouetted against the first pale suggestion of dawn. Nasser Celebi hurrying toward the storerooms, muttering calculations under his breath. Carlo pausing at the door to look back at the Sultan, a look that contained something more than obedience, something closer to love, the love that a student bears for a teacher who has shown him not just how to think but how to live. And then Orhan was alone. Alone in the council chamber, with the map spread before him and the oil lamp burning low, and the weight of an empire pressing down on him like the hand of God. He looked at the map. He looked at Kara Dera, that narrow passage between the mountains where Orhan would make his stand. He traced the ridgelines with his finger. He calculated distances and travel times, and the 1,000 variables that could turn victory into defeat or defeat into survival. And he prayed. Not formally, not with the ritualized movements and recitations of the 5 daily prayers, but informally, privately, in the way that men pray when they are truly afraid and truly faithful, and understand that these two things are not contradictions but companions. He said, Your Allah, you who see what I cannot see, you who know what I cannot know, guide my hand, steady my heart, protect these men who ride into danger on my command. And if it is written that this empire should fall, then let it fall fighting. Let it fall with its face toward the enemy and its heart toward you. Let it fall in a way that the generations who come after us will speak of and say, they did not surrender. They did not bow, they stood. By Allah, they stood. The lamp flickered, the shadows moved, and the dawn prayer, the adhan, rose from the minarets of Bursa like a voice calling from another world, a world where there was no war, no scheming, no betrayal, no fear, only the pure, unmediated presence of the divine, vast and compassionate, and beyond the reach of swords. Orhan listened, he let the sound wash over him, and then he straightened, and he became once again the Sultan, not the man who prayed in the dark, not the man who feared for his friends, but the Sultan, the commander, the one they all looked to when the night was darkest and the way forward was unclear. And the way forward now was Kara Dera. While the palace stirred with the controlled chaos of preparation, while soldiers checked their weapons and saddled their horses and embraced their wives and children with the particular intensity of men who know they may never embrace them again, life in the outer quarters of the palace continued as though nothing had changed. Because for those who did not yet know what was coming, nothing had changed. The sun rose, the bread was baked, the children played. The women went about their duties with the steady, unbreakable rhythm that held the fabric of daily life together, while the men tore at it with their wars and their politics, and their endless, exhausting competition for power and territory, and the right to call themselves lords of something. Malhan Khatun knew, she always knew. She could read Orhan's face the way a navigator reads the stars, and when he had come to her chamber before the council meeting and sat beside her and held her hand and said nothing for a full minute, she had understood everything that his silence contained. She had said, how bad? He had said, bad enough that I am sending Orhan. She had closed her eyes, she had taken a breath, and then she had opened her eyes and said, then we prepare. Tell me what is needed and it will be done. This was why he loved her, not because she was beautiful though she was, not because she was kind though she was that too, but because she was unbreakable. Because when the storm came, she did not cower or weep or beg for reassurance. She squared her shoulders and asked what needed to be done, and then she did it, with a competence and a grace that made the impossible seem merely difficult, and the difficult seem routine. Now in the women's quarters, Malhan Khatun gathered the household. Nilüfer came with young Murad on her hip, the child's eyes wide and curious, sensing the change in atmosphere the way animals sense an approaching earthquake. Halima came, her face tight with worry that she was trying and failing to conceal. Fatima came, and she was not the smiling, teasing woman who had tormented Evrenos in the courtyard. She was the leader of the Bajian, and her eyes were hard and her posture was straight, and the sword that she wore at her side was not decorative. Malhan Khatun said, the Sultan has ordered a deployment. Orhan rides tonight with 500 men. I do not need to explain to you what this means. You are not children. You understand that when soldiers ride, the women must ensure that everything behind them is secure. Fatima, the Bajian, must be ready. If the city is threatened, you will be responsible for the defense of the inner quarters. Halima, the medical supplies must be inventoried and prepared. When the wounded come, and they will come, we must be ready to receive them. Nilüfer, the children must be moved to the inner palace. All of them, not just ours, every child in the household. If the worst comes, the inner palace is the last place that falls. Each woman nodded, each woman understood. This was not the first time they had received such instructions. It would not be the last. This was the rhythm of their lives, the terrible, exhausting, necessary rhythm of women who loved men who went to war and who had to be strong enough to hold the world together while those men were gone. Fatima said, I will assemble the Bajian within the hour. We have 37 women trained in combat and another 50 who can handle a bow. If the walls are breached, they will find us waiting. Malhan Khatun looked at her. She said, Fatima, if the walls are breached, I will be standing beside you. Something passed between them. A look, a recognition, the silent acknowledgement of two women who understood that their strength was not a supplement to the strength of men, but a force in its own right, equal and essential and terrible when provoked. Then the moment passed, and they went to work. And in the stables, as the afternoon sun crawled across the sky like a wounded animal, Evrenos was preparing his horse for the march. He had been assigned to Orhan's force. He had requested it. When Orhan had come to select his 500, Evrenos had stepped forward and said, I ride with you. Orhan had looked at him. He had said, you understand what this might mean. Evrenos had said, I understand. Orhan had said, and the matter of Fatima Khatun, the proposal, the marriage, these things will have to wait. Evrenos had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, if I fall at Kara Dera, the proposal will not matter. And if I survive, it will still be there waiting for me when I return. Either way, my place tonight is beside you, not in a palace counting gold I do not have." Tarhan had nodded, that was all, a nod, but in that nod was contained an entire vocabulary of respect and acceptance, and the unspoken bond between men who choose to walk toward death together. Now Evrenos tightened the girth of his saddle and checked his sword, and tested the string of his bow and filled his quiver, and said a prayer over each arrow, because a man who prays over his arrows is a man who understands that it is not the arrow that kills, but the will of God expressed through the archer's aim. Zarkute found him there. The old warrior leaned against the stable door and watched Evrenos prepare and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I would come with you if my knees would permit it." Evrenos said, "Your knees have carried you through more battles than I have years of life, Zarkute Saheb. They have earned their rest." Zarkute said, "Rest. I do not know this word. I have heard it spoken, but I have never understood its meaning." He paused. Then he said, "Evrenos, when you return, and you will return because I have not yet had the pleasure of watching Alauddin Saheb's face when we ask for Fatima's hand, and I refuse to be denied that entertainment. When you return, we will go together, you and I and Nasser. We will sit before the Sultan and his family, and we will make our case. And if Alauddin demands gold equal to Fatima's weight, I will tell him that the weight of your courage is worth more than all the gold in Anatolia, and if he does not accept that, then he is a fool, and I will tell him that too to his face, because I am old enough to say whatever I want and too stubborn to care about the consequences." Evrenos turned from his horse. He looked at Zarkute. His eyes were bright. He said, "Zarkute Saheb, you are the father I never had." Zarkute's face softened, just for a moment, just long enough for the man beneath the warrior to show himself. Then the hardness returned, because hardness was the armor that had kept Zarkute alive through decades of conflict, and he was not about to remove it now. He said, "Go, fight well, come back alive, and bring me something from the battlefield. A Byzantine helmet, perhaps. I have always wanted one. They are ridiculous looking, but they keep the rain off your head, and at my age, keeping the rain off my head is the closest thing to victory I can expect." Evrenos mounted his horse. He looked down at Zarkute. He said, "I will bring you 2 helmets." Zarkute said, "Bring me one. I have only one head." And Evrenos rode out of the stable and into the gathering dusk, and behind him, the 500 were assembling in the outer courtyard, their horses stamping and snorting, their armor catching the last light of the dying day, their faces set with the grim determination of men who have accepted an assignment from which there is no retreat. Tarhan rode to the front of the column. He turned his horse to face them. He did not make a speech. Tarhan was not a man of speeches. He said 3 sentences. He said, "We ride for Kara Dera. We hold the Narrows. Allah is with us." And then he turned his horse and rode through the gate, and the 500 followed, and the sound of their hooves on the road was like thunder, like a heartbeat, like the drumming of fate itself against the thin membrane of the present moment. Orhan Saheb watched them go from the ramparts. Malhan Khatun stood beside him. Neither spoke. They watched until the last rider had disappeared into the darkness, until the sound of hooves had faded to a memory, until there was nothing left but the night and the stars and the cold wind that blew down from the mountains, carrying with it the scent of pine and stone and the faint, almost imperceptible smell of smoke. Then Malhan said, "They will hold." Orhan said, "Inshallah." Malhan said, "Not inshallah, they will hold, because Tarhan leads them, and Tarhan does not know how to fail." Orhan looked at her, and in her eyes he saw something that he had not expected to see. Not worry, not fear, not even hope, certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who has placed her faith in something larger than armies and borders and the ambitions of kings. He took her hand. He said, "You are right, they will hold." And they stood together on the ramparts as the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal, indifferent procession, and somewhere in the darkness, 500 men rode toward a narrow valley where the fate of an empire would be decided by steel and blood, and the terrible, beautiful, unbreakable will to survive. The ride to Kara Dera took 2 days. 2 days of hard riding through terrain that punished both men and horses, through valleys where the wind cut like a knife and ridgelines where the footing was treacherous, and one wrong step would send horse and rider tumbling into chasms from which there was no return. Tarhan pushed them hard. He rotated the point riders every 2 hours. He sent scouts ahead in pairs, always in pairs, because a single scout who encounters the enemy dies without anyone knowing, but a pair can ensure that at least one man returns with the information. He allowed rest only when the horses demanded it, and even then the rest was brief, barely long enough for the animals to drink, and the men to chew strips of dried meat and check their weapons. On the first night they made camp in a hollow between 2 hills, sheltered from the wind, invisible from the road. Evrenos sat beside the small, carefully shielded fire and sharpened his sword, the rhythmic sound of stone on steel mixing with the whisper of wind through the grass. Damir Khan sat across from him. He said, "You are thinking about her." Evrenos did not look up. He said, "I am thinking about many things." Damir Khan said, "You are thinking about her. I can tell because you are sharpening a sword that is already sharp enough to split a hair lengthwise. A man only does that when his hands need something to do because his mind is elsewhere." Evrenos stopped sharpening. He looked at Damir Khan. He said, "If I fall tomorrow or the day after, what happens to everything I have planned? What happens to the proposal? What happens to Zarkute's promise? What happens to Fatima?" Damir Khan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If you fall in the service of Allah. You fall defending the land of the Muslims. You fall with a sword in your hand and the name of God on your lips. And Fatima Khatun will mourn you, and she will honor your memory, and she will live the rest of her life knowing that the man who loved her was not a coward who hid behind palace walls while others fought, but a warrior who rode into the darkness because it was the right thing to do." Is that not enough? Evrenos considered this. He said, "It is enough and it is not enough. It is enough for my honor. It is not enough for my heart." Damir Khan said, "Then do not fall. Stay alive. Fight like a man who has something to live for, because a man who has something to live for fights harder than a man who is merely willing to die. Dying is easy, Evrenos. Any fool can die. Living takes courage." Evrenos looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "When did you become wise, Damir Khan?" Damir Khan said, "I have always been wise. You have simply been too distracted by your own problems to notice." And despite everything, despite the danger and the darkness and the knowledge of what awaited them at Kara Dera, Evrenos found himself smiling. It was a small smile, brief and quickly extinguished, but it was real, and in that moment, in that small hollow between two hills with the fire burning low and the stars burning bright, it was enough. They reached Kara Dera on the evening of the second day. The narrows were exactly as the map had shown them, a passage between two steep ridges, perhaps 200 paces wide at the narrowest point, with walls of stone and forest rising on either side like the jaws of a beast waiting to close. The valley floor was strewn with boulders, and cut by a shallow stream that wound through the rocks like a silver thread. Tarhan surveyed the position from the eastern ridge. He stood on an outcropping of rock that jutted over the valley like the prow of a ship, and looked down at the passage below and saw, in his mind's eye, the enemy moving through it, compressed, vulnerable, unable to deploy their full strength, unable to bring their superior numbers to bear. He said to no one in particular, "This is where we hold them. This is where the tide turns." Then he turned to his commanders and issued orders with the crisp precision of a man who has been planning this engagement in his head for the entire 2-day ride. Damir Khan, take 200 men to the left ridge, position them behind the tree line, archers forward, swordsmen behind, do not reveal yourselves until I give the signal, let the enemy enter the narrows, let them commit, let them believe they are passing through unopposed, and then close the trap. Mahmud, take 150 men to the right ridge, same formation, archers and swordsmen, you will have the higher ground so your arrows will carry farther, use that advantage, target their officers first. An army without officers is a mob, and a mob can be broken. Evrenos, you are with me. We will hold the center of the valley with the remaining 150 cavalry. We are the anvil. When the enemy is caught between the ridges and cannot advance or retreat, we will charge into their center and break them apart like a hammer striking heated iron. Evrenos said, "And if they do not break?" Tarhan said, "Then we hit them again, and again, and again, until they break or we do, but we will not break, Evrenos. I have seen these men fight. I have seen what they are capable of when their backs are against the wall and their faith is in their hearts. They will not break." The night that followed was long and cold, and filled with the sounds of preparation. Men dug shallow trenches on the ridges and piled stones for cover. Archers counted their arrows and distributed them evenly, because in battle, an archer with 50 arrows beside a man with none is a waste of resources, but 2 archers with 25 arrows each are a sustained threat that the enemy must respect. Evrenos walked among the men in the valley. He checked their weapons. He checked their horses. He spoke to them, not with the grand rhetoric of a commander addressing troops, but with the simple, honest words of a man who shared their danger and their faith. He said to a young soldier who could not have been more than 17, "What is your name, brother?" The soldier said, "Selim, Selim bin Yusuf." Evrenos said, "Selim, have you fought before?" Selim said, "No, sir, this is my first engagement." Evrenos said, "Are you afraid?" Selim was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I am afraid." Evrenos put his hand on the young man's shoulder. He said, good, fear is not weakness, fear is intelligence. It is your body and your mind telling you that what you are about to do is dangerous and that you must be alert, that you must be careful, that you must not make mistakes. A man who is not afraid before battle is either a liar or a fool, and I do not ride with liars or fools. So keep your fear, Selim, let it sharpen you, let it make you faster and smarter and more aware. And when the moment comes, when the enemy is before you and there is no more time for thinking, your training will take over. Your body will know what to do, trust it, trust your brothers beside you, trust your God above you, and you will survive. Selim looked at him with eyes that were too young for this and too old for anything else. He said, thank you, sir. Evrenos moved on. He repeated this process 50 times, 100 times, speaking to each man, learning names, offering not false comfort but honest acknowledgement of the danger they faced and honest confidence in their ability to face it. And on the ridge, Turhan stood alone, looking east, watching the horizon for the first sign of dust, the first glint of armor, the first indication that the enemy was near. He saw nothing, not yet, but he could feel it. The way a sailor feels a storm before the first cloud appears. The way a wolf feels the presence of prey before the first scent reaches its nose. Something was coming, something large and angry and determined, and it was close. He whispered a prayer. He whispered the words of the prophet, peace be upon him, words that had been spoken 14 centuries earlier in a different desert, in a different time, but that carried the same meaning now as they had then. O Allah, I ask you for firmness in this matter, and I ask you for resolve in guidance, and I ask you for gratitude for your blessings, and I ask you for excellence in your worship, and I ask you for a truthful tongue and a sound heart. The wind carried his words away, the stars looked down, and somewhere in the darkness, an army was moving, and the gap between that army and the 500 men who waited at Kara Dera was closing with every passing hour. Dawn came grey and reluctant, as though the sun itself was hesitant to illuminate what was about to happen. A fog had settled in the valley overnight, thick and white, turning the narrows into a corridor of blindness. Men on the ridges could see nothing below. Men in the valley could see nothing above. The world had been reduced to a circle of visibility no more than 20 paces in diameter, and beyond that circle, everything was memory and guesswork and faith. Turhan did not like the fog. Fog negated his greatest advantage, the high ground, the ability to see the enemy approaching and engage them at range. In fog there was no range, there was only proximity, close quarters, sword work, the kind of fighting where numbers mattered more than position and the bigger army almost always won. He considered his options. He could wait for the fog to lift, but if the enemy was already in the narrows, waiting meant surrendering the initiative. He could send scouts forward, but scouts in fog were likely to stumble into the enemy and be killed before they could report. He could pull back and find another position, but there was no other position. Kara Dera was the best ground between here and Bursa, and if he abandoned it, the enemy would pass through unopposed. He made his decision. He sent word to Demir Khan and Mahmud, hold your positions, do not move, do not fire until you can see their faces. When the fog lifts, and it will lift, you will have perhaps 30 seconds before they realize they are surrounded. Use those 30 seconds, make every arrow count. Then he rode down to the valley where Evrenos and the cavalry waited. The horses were nervous. They could sense the tension in their riders. They could smell something on the wind that they did not like. Turhan said, Evrenos, when the fog lifts we will see them. They may be close, very close, closer than we would like. Evrenos said, how close? Turhan said, close enough that our first engagement will not be a charge, it will be a collision. Evrenos drew his sword. He said, then let it be a collision. I have spent my whole life waiting for things, waiting for approval, waiting for gold I do not have, waiting for permission to love the woman I love. I am tired of waiting, Turhan, let them come. Turhan looked at him, and for the first time in the many years that Evrenos had known him, Turhan smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a comforting smile. It was the smile of a man who recognizes a kindred spirit, a fellow warrior who has crossed the line from fear into acceptance and emerged on the other side as something both more and less than human. Turhan said, then we do not wait. We ride forward, into the fog. We find them before they find us. And when we find them, we hit them so hard that they will feel it in Constantinople. Evrenos said, and if there are 1,000 of them? Turhan said, then we make them pay for every step. We make this valley a graveyard for their ambitions. And if we fall facing Mecca, with our swords in our hands and the name of Allah on our lips, and that is a death that any man should be honored to die. He raised his sword. Behind him, 150 cavalrymen raised theirs. The sound of steel leaving scabbards was like a chorus, a hymn sung in the language of metal, and it echoed off the valley walls and disappeared into the fog like a challenge thrown into the face of the unknown. Turhan said, Bismillah, in the name of Allah, ride. And they rode, into the fog, into the white, blind, breathless nothing. and the sound of their hooves was like a heartbeat, and the fog swallowed them whole, and they were gone. And on the ridges, Damir Khan and Mahmud and their men crouched behind stones and trees and waited. They could hear the cavalry below, the fadding thunder of hooves. They could hear their own breathing, amplified by the fog into something that sounded like the breathing of the mountains themselves. And they waited. The fog held, minutes passed that felt like hours. The world was white and silent, and full of the terrible potential of violence that has not yet occurred, but is certain to come. And then they heard it, distant at first, then closer, then unmistakable. The sound of steel on steel, the sound of men screaming, the sound of horses colliding, the sound of battle erupting in the fog like a fire in a sealed room, invisible but devastating. Turhan had found them, or they had found Turhan. It did not matter which. What mattered was that the collision had occurred, and now the fog was filled with the sounds of men fighting and dying in a blindness that made every stroke a gamble and every moment a prayer. And the fog held, and the men on the ridges waited. And the battle raged below them, unseen, uncontrollable, unpredictable, a storm of violence wrapped in white silence, and they could do nothing but listen and wait and trust that when the moment came, when the fog finally lifted and revealed the truth of what was happening below, they would be ready. They would be ready. Because they had to be. Because there was no alternative. Because the war was not over. The war was never over. And it would not be over when the fog lifted. And it would not be over when the swords stopped singing. And it would not be over when the last body fell, and the valley ran red, and the crows came circling down from the grey sky to claim their portion of the feast. It would not be over. Because wars are not ended by battles. Wars are ended by the exhaustion of the will to fight, and the will of these men, the will of Turhan and Evrenos and Damir Khan and Mahmud, and the 500 who had ridden into the darkness on the word of their sultan, was not exhausted. It was just beginning. It was forged in fire and tempered in faith and sharpened on the stone of sacrifice, and it would not break. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. And the fog held, and the battle raged, and the story continued. As it always does. As it always will. Until the last sword is sheathed, and the last prayer is whispered, and the last breath of the last warrior fades into the silence of a world that remembers everything and forgives nothing. The war is not over. It has barely begun.
The dawn did not rise over Daravan, it bled into it. First the eastern sky turned the color of bruised iron, then violet, then a dim and troubled red, as though the sun itself approached reluctantly, knowing that what it was about to illuminate would stain the day before noon. The minarets of the city emerged from darkness one by one. The market roofs, the fountain in the square, the courthouse steps still damp with night dew, the walls of Killil's compound in the northeast quarter, pale and severe and silent as a tomb. Then the people came. They came before the call to prayer had fully faded. They came in cloaks thrown hastily over night clothes, in workers' tunics, in widows' black, in merchants' silks and laborers' wool, and they filled the square not with the noise of a mob, but with the grave hush of a people who had decided that this day would belong to truth or to no one. They stood shoulder to shoulder around the fountain, along the steps of the courthouse, on rooftops and balconies and window ledges, their faces turned eastward toward the road by which Şahinşah would come. Orhan Sahib stood where he had stood the day before, beside the fountain whose water still ran with the same patient indifference it had shown to empires and famines and kings who believed themselves immortal. He wore no cloak of state, no jeweled armor, no banner behind him. His breastplate was plain, scarred, cleaned, but not polished. His sword rested at his side in a sheath that had seen too many campaigns to pretend at ceremony. Faladios stood to his right, grave and sleepless, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blade, his eyes moving between the streets that fed into the square and the northeast quarter, where Killil remained behind his private walls. Damir Khan was farther back, posted on the courthouse steps with 50 archers hidden among the crowd and on the roofs, not to threaten the people, but to guard them. Jakarta Sahib, newly turned by truth and not yet forgiven by himself, stood among the city officials near the courthouse doors, rigid as a man awaiting sentence. The city had changed overnight. The courthouse had opened its records chamber before dawn. The Qadis had convened. Altadin Sahib's messengers had arrived in the darkness with the council's seals and warrants, carrying legal authority more powerful in that square than any cavalry charge.
Killal's properties were under investigation. His ledgers were named in formal accusation. The testimonies of the villagers had been recorded. The machinery of law, slow for years because gold had been poured into its joints, was moving now with a terrible, grinding purity, as if ashamed of how long it had slept. And still Killal had not appeared. He had sent no herald. He had made no denial. He had not come to the square to defend himself or accuse Orhan or plead innocence before the people he had fed and deceived in equal measure. That silence told Orhan much. A man innocent of such charges would have rushed to the square before sunrise to proclaim his innocence. A guilty man, if he were brave, would at least have attempted a performance of injured dignity. But Killal was neither innocent nor brave. He was calculating. And silence, from a man like him, meant movement. It meant plans within plans. It meant that while the city watched the square, he watched the exits. Orhan felt it before he saw it. The city's breath changed. The people at the eastern edge of the square drew closer together, not in panic, but in instinctive recall from something approaching at speed. Then the sound came, hooves striking stone, iron on paving, hard and fast and reckless. A rider burst into the square from the east, his horse flecked with foam, his own cloak torn at the shoulder and dark with blood. Orhan! The square stirred like a field under sudden wind. Men reached for weapons. Women pulled children behind them. But Orhan rode straight to the fountain, reined in so sharply that the horse half-reared, then came down hard, snorting steam into the morning chill. Orhan's face was ash-pale beneath the dust and blood. One line of dried crimson ran from his hairline to his jaw. An arrow shaft had snapped off through the rim of his shield, and another had torn his sleeve where it had grazed his upper arm. Yet he sat his horse, like a man carved from basalt. "He is close," Orhan said, and though he was breathing hard, his voice carried, "Closer than I thought." He cast aside half his baggage and rode through the night with only picked men, 40 still mounted, 20 more on foot behind. They are no more than an hour away. Orhan looked at the blood on Orhan's sleeve. "And you?" Orhan gave the smallest motion of dismissal. "Breathing, which is enough." Faladios stepped close. "You should dismount." Orhan shook his head once. "When he comes, he will look first for me. Let him see that I still sit a horse." Orhan studied him for one heartbeat longer, then nodded. There was no time for tenderness, and men like Orhan would not have known what to do with it even if there had been. Then the first horn sounded beyond the eastern gate. It was not a battle horn, not the deep, rolling summons of a field army. It was sharper, higher, meant to part crowds and signal the arrival of rank. A horn of a man who still imagined himself obeyed by the world because the world had obeyed him for so long. A murmur passed through the square. Faces turned. On the rooftops, boys crouched lower for a better view. The city guards at the eastern approaches drew back, uncertain whether they were making way for a sovereign, a fugitive, or a dead man who had not yet accepted the news. Şahinşah entered Daravan with 40 riders and the remains of his dignity. Wore no crown, that alone told the story more clearly than any proclamation could have. His armor was hastily buckled, one shoulder guard missing, one gauntlet replaced by a leather riding glove. Dust coated his cloak. His horse was good but spent, the sort of mount a man takes when speed matters more than appearance. Behind him rode loyalists whose loyalty had the brittle shine of men who had chosen their side too late and too publicly to reverse themselves now. Some carried Şahinşah's colors. Others rode without banners, perhaps ashamed, perhaps merely practical. A few were clearly mercenaries by their bearing and equipment, their eyes moving not toward the square, but toward doorways and rooftops and alleys, measuring threat in coins' worth. Şahinşah reached the edge of the square and reined in. He had expected fear, perhaps even obedience. The old habits of power do not die quickly. A man who has spent years entering places where all rose at his arrival does not easily imagine a day when they do not. But no one knelt, no one bowed, no one cried his titles. The square held its silence, and that silence struck him harder than any spear could have done. Orhan stepped forward into the open center of the square. Şahinşah. The name rang across stone. Şahinşah looked at him, and for a moment the years between the first wound and this final confrontation seemed to gather in the space between their eyes. Every village burned, every oath corrupted, every ally purchased, every death converted into ledger ink and political advantage. All of it stood there with them in the morning light, unseen but more solid than the fountain, more real than the crowd, more permanent than the walls of Daravan. So Şahinşah said at last, "You have traded battlefields for market squares." Orhan's voice remained calm. "And you have traded kingship for flight." A pulse moved through the crowd, not laughter, nothing so light, but the grim, involuntary acknowledgement of a blow rightly struck. Şahinşah sat straighter in his saddle. "I fled treachery, not justice. You took me through deceit. You poisoned my roads, turned my commanders, bought the tongues of peasants, and now you stand amid a crowd as though noise were law. This is not judgment. This is theater." Orhan raised the documents in his hand. "No, this is evidence. Theater was your reign. Theater was your piety while grain was stolen. Theater was your promises of peace while Killal's wagons carried weapons to both sides of the war. Theater was the mask you wore while others bled for your bargains." Şahinşah's expression did not crack, but Orhan saw the flicker in his eyes, not surprise. He had known some of it was exposed, but not how much, not how deeply the rot had been traced into the beams of the house he thought still standing. "You speak Killal's name very freely for a man who claims to oppose him," Şahinşah said, curious. "A merchant rises because men like you need merchants. Armies eat, horses drink, steel costs coin. If Killal prospered, it is because war prospers every man who feeds it. You are not outside the wheel, Orhan. You only tell yourself that because your hands tremble when you look at blood honestly." That struck not Orhan but the people, because it was designed for them. Şahinşah had always understood the usefulness of half-truth. He did not deny, he diluted. He did not refute, he implicated. It was the instinct of a ruler who could no longer command facts and therefore sought to drown them in the muddy flood of universal guilt. Orhan took a step closer. "Listen well, Daravan. This is how a corrupt ruler speaks when the walls close in. He tells you everyone is equally guilty. He tells the robbed they are the same as the thief, the hungry the same as the hoarder, the mother who buried her son the same as the man who sold the spear that killed him. Because if all hands are dirty, then no one may call another to account." He turned back to Şahinşah. "Yes, war feeds many men, but only one kind of man ensures it never ends because peace lessens his profits. Only one kind of ruler accepts such service and calls it necessity. Do not clothe greed in fate before these people. They have seen too much to be fooled by silk words." For the first time, Şahinşah's gaze shifted from Orhan to the crowd around him. He saw not subjects but witnesses, not fear but judgment gathering itself. He saw city officials on the courthouse steps holding council warrants. He saw Qadis in their robes, stern and unmoving. He saw Jakarta Sahib standing not at his side but across from him. And in that moment, he understood that he had arrived not to reclaim power, but to find that power had already gone elsewhere. "Where is Killal?" he asked suddenly. It was the wrong question. He knew it the instant it left his mouth. The crowd heard it too, not "Where are the charges?" not "What law accuses me?" not "Who defamed me?" but "Where is Killal?" Faladios smiled then, not with mirth, but with the cold satisfaction of a hunter who hears the trap spring. Orhan did not smile. "You tell us," he said. And then the first scream rose from the northeast quarter. It was followed at once by another, then a clamor of bells, then the unmistakable crash of a gate forced inward. Every head in the square turned. Over the rooftops there appeared a plume of black smoke, narrow at first, then thickening, darkening, writhing upward like a serpent disturbed in its hole. Demir Khan was already moving. Riders from the courthouse side sprinted toward the smoke. City guards shouted and pushed through alleys. On the roofs, archers shifted their positions, turning from the square to the northeast approaches. A runner came breathless across the paving stones, nearly falling as he reached the fountain. "Sultan," he cried, then caught himself and bowed his head. "Sahib, Killal's compound, the guards are fighting, the record's house is on fire." Orhan did not waste a heartbeat. Faladios with me. Damir Khan, hold the square. No panic. No one lets Şahinşah leave. Jakarta Sahib, the warrants. Bring the Qadis and council seals. If Killal's records burn before they are seized, I want witnesses enough to condemn him by what remains. Turhan. Turhan had already wheeled his horse. I go through the north lanes, he said. If Killal runs, he will not run through his own smoke. He will seek the side gate. Orhan nodded once. Alive if possible. Turhan's answer was flat. If Allah wills. Then the square broke, not into chaos, but into urgent, directed motion. Orhan and Faladios mounted and drove toward the northeast quarter at the head of 20 riders. Behind them came Jakarta with council men and scribes clutching warrant scrolls as if parchment could outrun fire. The people of Daravan did not flee. They parted. They opened lanes through their own streets, shouting directions, pointing to alleys, carrying water buckets before anyone had asked them to. It was no longer a square watching history. It was a city entering it. The nearer they came to Killal's compound, the thicker the smoke grew. By the time they reached the outer lane, the sun itself was smeared behind blackness and sparks rode the wind like red insects. The private wall had been breached at the eastern gate, not from outside, but from within. One leaf of the gate hung twisted on its hinges. Bodies lay in the entry court, some in Killal's livery, some city guards, one or two civilians caught too close to the wrong wall at the wrong moment. Beyond them, the records house burned. It was not an accidental fire. Orhan saw that at once. The blaze was too focused, too cleverly laid. Oil had been poured along the interior beams. The flames climbed not randomly, but with ruthless efficiency, consuming shelves and rafters, racing toward the upper archive where ledgers and contracts and sealed correspondence would have been stored. Killal, cornered by law, had chosen his oldest loyalty, not to life, not to city, to concealment. Mercenaries still held the inner yard. They had formed a defensive crescent between the burning records house and the central residence, shields up, crossbows leveled toward the broken gate. Their captain wore scaled armor over crimson surcoat, his helmet crested with horsehair, his beard bound in metal rings. He stood broad-legged and unshaken amid smoke and falling cinders, the still point of a hired storm. Killad's Faladios said. Orhan glanced at him. You know him. I know of him, Killal's hound, sells his sword high and his pity low. Killad's shouted as Orhan's riders entered the outer yard. One step more and the archives burn complete, another and the prisoners die. Only then did Orhan see them, 3 men and 2 women kneeling near the residence steps, hands bound, faces bruised, scribes, account keepers, the people who knew where the true ledgers were stored, where the duplicate books were hidden, which seals had been forged and which debts were real. Killal had not merely tried to burn evidence. He had intended to kill memory itself. Orhan dismounted. Do not loose, he said quietly to his men. Killad saw him walking forward on foot through ash and smoke and gave a short, harsh laugh. So this is the famous Orhan Sahib, not charging, not shouting, walking like a Qadi into a market quarrel. Orhan's eyes did not leave the prisoners. Release them. Killad's rested his sword on one shoulder. And what then? I lay down my blade and trust law. Law is a banner men wave when they have more archers than courage. Faladios dismounted beside Orhan. You are trapped, Killad's. Killad's shrugged. Trapped is a word for men who fear death. I fear unpaid service more. Killal bought my oath dear. I will spend it dear. Orhan studied the angles. The crossbowmen on the left wall walk, 2 on the roofline of the residence, 3 more half hidden behind water cisterns in the yard. If he ordered a rush, prisoners died first. If he waited, the fire consumed the records house and perhaps spread to the residence. The smoke thickened with every breath. Time was no ally now, it was flame. Then another sound rose beyond the walls. Shouting, hooves, the city not panicking but converging. Daravan's people were coming, carrying ladders, hooks, water skins, axes. Killal had hidden among them for years. Now they came not as a mob, but as a people denied too long. Killad's heard it too, his jaw tightened. Keep them back, he barked to no one in particular, because the men he had left to guard the wall towers were either dead, fled, or already discovering that a city can become a siege engine if given reason enough. Orhan spoke low to Faladios. "When I move, take the captain." "Alive." Faladios' mouth hardened. "If he permits." Orhan moved 3 paces forward. "Kulads, hear me. Killil burns the records because he never meant to leave you a future. Dead men are cheaper than loyal men. When this yard falls, he will not return for your bones. Release the scribes, take your men and walk out. There are witnesses here. The city will hear that you spared lives. That mercy will wait for you." Kulad spat into the ash. "Mercy is for those who can afford defeat." From above came the whistle of a bolt loosed too soon, perhaps by a crossbowman maddened by smoke or fear. It flew not at Orhan, but at one of the bound scribes, the old reflex of hired terror: kill the witness before the witness can speak. Tarhan's blade was not there. Tarhan was somewhere beyond the compound, hunting exits, but Demir Khan's training was. One of the archers positioned along the broken wall loosed instantly, and his arrow struck the bolt mid-flight just near enough to break its line. The shaft spun and buried itself in the stone step by the scribe's knee. In that heartbeat of shock, Orhan moved. He did not draw first. He closed first, using astonishment as cover. By the time Kulads's crossbowmen found their bearings, Orhan was already inside the nearest line of fire, too close for bolts to be safely loosed without killing their own captain. Faladios came with him like an echo sharpened into steel. One of the mercenaries lunged with a spear. Orhan swept it aside and struck the man with his shoulder rather than his blade, driving him backward into another guard. Faladios reached Kulads at the same instant, and the yard changed from standoff to storm. Kulads was fast. Not merely strong, fast in the way of men who have survived by killing quicker than expectation. His first stroke came low, almost lazy, then rose with terrifying speed toward Faladios' ribs. Faladios barely turned it. Sparks jumped. The second came backhanded toward the throat. Faladios ducked under it and answered with a cut that would have opened a lesser man from hip to shoulder. Kulads caught it on the rim of his bracer and stepped in with his forehead, smashing it against Faladios' face. Faladios reeled. Kulads drove forward, sword hammering, each blow heavy enough to numb the arm that received it. Around them, the yard detonated. Mercenaries crashed into Orhan's riders. Bound scribes flung themselves flat as steel flashed overhead. Crossbowmen on the roof tried to find angles through the chaos. Demir Khan's hidden archers on neighboring walls began picking them off one by one, shafts humming through smoke. The people of Daravan reached the outer breach and began hauling water toward the record's house, while city guards formed desperate lines to keep the unarmed from the killing yard. Orhan cut the bonds of the nearest prisoner with one stroke, shoved him towards safety, and turned in time to catch an axe blow on his blade. The impact jarred up his arm to the shoulder. He pivoted, let the attacker's momentum carry through, then struck with the pummel under the ear. The man dropped. Another mercenary came from the left. Orhan parried high, stepped inside, drove an elbow into the man's throat, then hooked his ankle and threw him into the dust. He saw Killil then. Not in the yard, not among the fight. Above, on a narrow balcony that connected the residence to the burning record's house by a covered passage. Killil wore a dark robe over light armor, a merchant trying at last to look like a commander and achieving only the appearance of a crow dressed for a wedding. In his hands, he carried not a sword but a leather satchel. Accounts, seals, portable wealth in paper form. His eyes flicked once across the yard, not in concern for the men dying below, but in calculation of the fastest route to flee. Orhan shouted his name. Killil! The merchant froze. Their eyes met through heat, shimmer, and smoke. There he is, Faladios roared. Killil turned and ran into the covered passage. Orhan started for the stairs, but 3 mercenaries closed the gap. He cut down the first, wounded the second, kicked the third into the steps, and by then the passage roof had caught fully. Fire raced along its tarred timbers with a hungry, crackling sound that swallowed Killil from view. Faladios was still with Kulads. It had become no longer a duel of skill alone, but of rage and endurance. Kulads fought like a paid beast, brutal and efficient, every opening exploited, every half-beat used. Palladios fought like a man to whom this moment had been promised by fate, not because Culad's mattered in himself, but because men like Culad's were the iron teeth of the machine he had spent this campaign dismantling. Smoke coated them both. Sweat ran black with soot. Their blades flashed in red-orange bursts through the dirty air. Culad's feinted left and hurled a dagger with his off-hand. Palladios twisted. The dagger scored his side but did not sink deep. In the same motion, Palladios let his own sword go low, lower than seemed wise, almost yielding the line. Culad's took the bait. He committed to the killing stroke, a downward chop meant to split helm and skull. Palladios stepped not back but in, turning under the descending blade so close that steel scraped his shoulder plate. His hilt slammed into Culad's jaw. Teeth flew, then Palladios' blade came up under the captain's breastbone and stopped there, driven to the guard. Culad's made a sound that was not quite a cry. He looked down, saw the steel inside him, and laughed once in disbelief, as if death itself were an outrageous overcharge added to a bill he had not agreed to pay. Palladios leaned close. "Your master flees." Culad's tried to answer, but blood filled his mouth before words could. Palladios pulled the sword free. Culad staggered 3 steps and fell into the ash at the foot of the record's house, as though the earth, at last, had presented him the only contract he could not negotiate. Palladios turned at once, searching for Killul, but the passage above gave a groan like an animal dying and collapsed inward in a burst of flame. Burning beams crashed into the balcony and shattered it. The route to the upper level vanished in a rain of sparks and timber. "He's taking the lower tunnels," one of the freed scribes shouted, coughing black smoke. "The cellar vault, there's a culvert beneath the wine store, he can reach the north canal." "Orhan." Orhan's eyes flashed toward the northern wall. "Go," he shouted. But even as the word left his mouth, a horn sounded from beyond the city's eastern quarter. Not one horn, many, the deep, battered, field-worn horns of riders entering a city at speed, with no care for law or crowd or stone beneath hoof. Şahinşah. He had arrived before the compound was secured. The sound reached the yard and changed every face. Mercenaries who had been wavering stiffened, hearing in those horns the possibility of rescue, of renewed wages, of a banner to rally to. The city guards at the breach faltered for a heartbeat, glancing east. The people carrying water froze, fear and outrage warring in their bodies. Orhan saw the whole shape at once. Şahinşah entering from the east, Killul fleeing north through the tunnels, the compound half taken, half burning, the city on the edge between law and battle. He made his choice with the speed of a man who had no more time to think, and no right to think slowly. Palladios finished the fire, save what records remain, Jakarta Sahib with him, every scribe alive to the courthouse. Damir Khan, eastern streets, stop Şahinşah before he reaches the square, not slaughter, contain him, break his momentum in the alleys, use the city against the horse. "And you," Palladios asked. Orhan mounted in one fluid motion. "I take the North Canal." He wheeled his horse through smoke and broken gate, just as Orhan appeared at the far lane like something summoned by the need of the hour itself. His horse was different now, a grey city mare seized or borrowed en route. Behind him rode 6 men only, 20 had gone with him, 6 remained, their faces said enough. "He's in the tunnels," Orhan said at once. Orhan nodded. "North Canal." "Together then," Orhan said. "Together," Orhan answered. They rode north through lanes too narrow for proper cavalry, shoulders brushing plaster walls, hooves striking sparks from paving stones slick with spilled water and ash. Above them shutters opened and slammed. Voices shouted warnings from rooftops. Somewhere behind, in the eastern quarter, Şahinşah's riders were colliding with city barricades hastily thrown across the broad streets, carts overturned, timber beams dragged into place, market stalls toppled into obstacles. Damir Khan's work had begun already. The city itself was becoming terrain. They reached the North Canal just as Killul emerged from a stone culvert beneath an old warehouse. He did not emerge alone. 8 guards came first, then the merchant himself, dragging the leather satchel and a smaller iron casket chained to his wrist, followed by 2 servants bent under sacks that were too neatly packed to be grain. Coin, seals, portable empire. The canal ran black and sluggish beneath a row of willow trees. At its mooring posts waited a narrow river barge with sails furled and oars shipped, ready to push off the instant Killil boarded. He had prepared his flight well. Of course he had. Men like Killil always built exits before they built walls. Orhan never slowed. He drove straight for the nearest guard, took a crossbow bolt on his shield, another on the horse's chest armor, and still closed the distance before the guards could reset their aim. His first blade broke a spear shaft. His second opened the face behind it. He was through them at once, inside their spacing, where numbers became confusion and confusion became death. Orhan angled left, cutting Killil off from the gangplank. The merchant saw him and stumbled backward, the casket chain clattering against the stones. One servant dropped his sack and ran. A guard cut him down, not from loyalty, but to silence panic. The other servant threw himself into the canal and vanished under the black water. Killil raised both hands, not in surrender, but in instinctive defense. A man who had spent his life fending off accusation with gesture and speech, and suddenly found gesture too small and speech too slow. Orhan Sahib, he cried, listen, listen before blood seals folly forever. Orhan reigned in 3 paces away. Speak quickly. Around them steel rang. Orhan fought 3 men at the foot of the gangplank. One slashed downward from the higher board. Orhan caught the blade, shoved it wide, and cut backward without looking, taking the knee from the man behind him. Another lunged low. Orhan turned, the lunge passed beneath his arm, and he drove his short blade down through collarbone into the heart. Killil saw it, and his lips trembled, but greed is a faith deeper than courage and harder to renounce. You think this ends with me, he said. You think the ledgers burn and the grain is taken and one merchant falls and justice has been served. Foolish, childish, I am not the machine, I am one of its gears. There are greater men above me, men in ports you have never seen, men in courts whose names you do not know. Gold moves farther than horses, Orhan, wider than armies. Kill me and another takes my place by winter. Orhan's voice was quiet. Then by winter there will be one less. Killil swallowed. His eyes darted toward the canal, toward the barge, toward the widening gap as Orhan's surviving riders drove the remaining guards backward. You need me alive, Killil said. You need names, routes, accounts beyond those you seized. I can give you all of them, every partner, every hidden store, every judge I paid, every commander I purchased, every caravan master who moved my freight. I can give you the map beneath the map. Orhan looked at him with the stillness that had unnerved stronger men than this. And what price do you set on truth now that it no longer serves you? Killil hesitated. There it was, even now at the lip of the canal with blood on the stones and his private army breaking around him, he thought in price. Safe passage, he whispered. Exile, protection from the council. Let me leave this land and you shall have everything. Orhan hurled the last guard from the gangplank into the canal. The man struck the water hard and did not rise. Then Orhan turned, chest heaving, blood on both blades, not all of it his own. Orhan! At that same instant came a roar from the eastern streets, closer now. Şahinşah had broken part of the blockade. The city battle was moving toward them, carried through lanes and intersections by the sound of hooves, screams, and the heavy percussion of horses forced where horses should not go. There was no more time for bargaining. Orhan dismounted. You spent years pricing human need, he said. You priced grain against hunger. You priced peace against profit. You priced loyalty, faith, death itself. And now, at the end, you try to price justice. There is no market for it, Killil. Not here, not anymore. Killil's face changed then. The merchant vanished. What remained was the naked animal beneath commerce, the soul stripped to appetite and terror. He flung the iron casket at Orhan's face. Orhan turned. The casket struck his shoulder and fell. In the same motion, Killil snatched a slim blade from inside his sleeve and lunged, not with a warrior's line, but with the clumsy, desperate savagery of a trapped man. Orhan caught his wrist, twisted, heard the bones crack, and the hidden knife clattered to the stones. Killul screamed. Orhan drove him to his knees. "Bind him," Orhan said. Tarhan was already there. He tore the chain from the casket, wrapped it around Killul's wrists and elbows in 2 brutal turns, then forced the merchant face down against the canal stones. "Alive," Tarhan said. "Alive," Orhan answered. Then an arrow hissed from the alley mouth. Tarhan moved before sight became thought. He threw himself sideways into Orhan, driving him clear as the shaft passed where his throat had been and buried itself in the willow trunk behind. Şahinşah's riders burst from the lane at that instant, 6 abreast where the street allowed only 4, forcing through civilians and debris with total disregard, their former ruler at their center with sword drawn and face lit not by courage, but by the final madness of a man who believed that if he could not reclaim the world, he would at least spoil it. Şahinşah saw Killul bound on the stones and gave a cry like a beast wounded in the lungs. No! He was not charging to save Daravan, nor to save justice, nor even to save his own future. He was charging because if Killul fell alive, he himself was finished. Killul carried names, records, conversations, proof not only of corruption but of dependence. Their fates had narrowed to a single thread. Orhan mounted in one motion, while Tarhan seized Killul by the chain and dragged him bodily behind the willow line, out of immediate reach. The canal bank became a battlefield too small for proper battle, a splinter of stone and water and mud, where every angle mattered and every heartbeat chose who would still be standing in the next. The first of Şahinşah's riders hit hard. Orhan's horse collided shoulder to shoulder with the lead mount, knocking it sideways into the canal rail. The rider swung down. Orhan parried, cut across the forearm, then reversed the stroke into the second man's neck. Tarhan, on foot now, fought like the lock on a gate, immovable, killing any rider who tried to force passage to Killul. Şahinşah himself came through the center. Their swords met at last not in a field, not before armies, but on the narrow stones beside black water, beneath willow branches and drifting ash. The clash rang bright and terrible. Şahinşah was still formidable. Age had not taken his wrists, and desperation had lent him a speed that bordered on frenzy. He attacked not with measured combinations, but with a sovereign's wrath, each blow carrying years of entitlement, humiliation, denial. Orhan gave ground half a step, then no more. Their blades moved between them in savage arcs, steel blurring in the cramped space. "You ruined everything," Şahinşah snarled. Orhan turned a cut and answered with one of his own. "No, I showed it was already ruined." Şahinşah drove forward, hammering downward. Orhan caught the blow and felt the shock tear through shoulder and back. Another rider came at his flank. Tarhan intercepted, taking a slash across the ribs to drive his own blade through the attacker's jaw. Faladios was not there. Demirhan was not there. This was no grand line of war now. This was the stripped core of it. Man against man, truth against the ruin that lies until its last breath. Şahinşah disengaged suddenly and lunged past Orhan toward Killul. Tarhan saw it and stepped in. The blade meant for Killul struck Tarhan under the collar where the armor joined and bit deep. For the first time in all the campaigns Orhan had fought beside him, Tarhan made a sound of pain that was not anger but astonishment, as if his own body had done something discourteous and unexpected. Everything slowed. Orhan saw the blood, too much of it, saw Tarhan's eyes sharpen, not dim, sharpen, because men like him grew more dangerous in the instant between wound and weakness. Tarhan trapped Şahinşah's sword arm with his left forearm despite the blood pouring down beneath it, drove his short blade into Şahinşah's side once, twice, not killing strokes because armor turned them, but enough to break balance. Orhan stepped in and struck. His blade came across Şahinşah's wrist. The sword flew from the ruler's hand and spun into the canal. Water closed over it with barely a sound. Şahinşah staggered back, clutching the ruined wrist, blood darkening the leather glove. "It is done," Orhan said. Şahinşah looked at him, then at Killul bound on the stones, then at Tarhan swaying but still upright with blood soaking his armor, then at the city around them, where Daravan's people were pouring into the lane, where city guards and Demir Khan's men were closing from behind, where there was no road left, no ally left, no lie left large enough to shelter inside. He laughed then, but there was no strength in it. Done, he echoed, nothing is done, kill me and another rises, take him and 10 merchants replace him, the world you dream of does not survive men. Orhan's answer came without heat. Then it will have to survive despite you. Şahinşah looked at the oncoming crowd and the guards and the Qadis, officers carrying warrants, and realized, at last and completely, that he would not die in a charge. He would live. He would be judged. For men like him, that was always the greater terror. He sank to his knees. The city took a breath. Then the bells began. Not alarm bells now, not temple or market bells struck in panic. The courthouse bells, slow, deliberate summoning bells, the sound of law claiming the day from violence. One after another they rolled across Daravan, over canal and market and wall and courtyard, and as they rang, the people stopped at the edge of the lane and did not rush in. They did not tear at Şahinşah. They did not stone Killil where he lay. They held. By Allah, they held. That moved Orhan more than any victory. He had won by blade. The Qadi arrived under guard with Jakarta Sahib beside him and scribes carrying sealed boards and ink. They came to the canal bank as men come to a battlefield after the charge, grave, careful, fully aware that if they faltered now, the morning would collapse back into blood. The Qadi looked first at Şahinşah kneeling, then at Killil chained, then at Orhan. Get him a physician, Orhan said at once. Physicians were already coming, pushed to the front by the crowd, carrying satchels and cloth and the sharp smell of herbs. Orhan resisted them until Orhan himself gripped his uninjured shoulder and said, "That is an order," and only then did he allow the men to lower him to the stones by the willow roots. Killil and Şahinşah were taken into custody under public warrant, not dragged, not beaten, taken. The distinction mattered. It mattered to Orhan. It mattered to the Qadi. It mattered to the people who watched and would carry the memory of this day into every retelling. Justice was not a frenzy. Justice was a hand that did not shake. The records salvaged from the compound began arriving by cart. Wet, charred, half-burned ledgers wrapped in blankets. Sealed boxes rescued from cellar vaults. Testimony from scribes who coughed smoke and named names with the clarity of men who had spent too long writing lies for other people and had discovered, too late but not too late, the relief of speaking plainly. By noon the square was fuller than it had been at dawn. Killil stood in chains before the courthouse. Şahinşah stood beside him, bandaged, pale, and for the first time in his life unable to command even the shape of the room. The Qadis read charges. The people listened. Witnesses from Ashkara, from the eastern valleys, from villages whose names Daravan had never cared to learn, spoke one by one. Grain seizure, forced prices, famine, arms sold across battle lines, bribes. Assassinations concealed as raids, names spilled into daylight like oil. And when at last the Qadi asked Killil whether he denied the records, the merchant did what merchants always do when denial is no longer possible. He tried to reduce evil to arithmetic. I did what the world required, he said. Cities must eat, armies must move, markets do not run on sentiment. If I profited, it was because I was capable where others were weak. If rulers came to me, it was because rulers always come to men who can do what must be done. The square listened in silence. No one interrupted, no one needed to. Then the Qadi turned to Şahinşah. And you, did you know? Şahinşah stood a long time without answering. He looked old now, older than the years he had ruled, older perhaps than the sins he carried. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that the square leaned to hear. I knew enough. Not all Orhan thought, but enough. Enough to condemn, enough to choose, enough to continue. The Qadi bowed his head once, the motion of a man receiving not a surprise, but a confirmation of grief. The proceedings would not end that day. Such crimes required days, perhaps weeks, of testimony and review and legal pronouncement. Orhan knew this. He welcomed it. Swift vengeance is easy. Lasting judgment is slow because it must be clean. So he did not ask for sentences. He did not ask for execution or exile or confiscation before the law had completed itself. He had dragged truth into the light. Now the light must do its work. By afternoon, Daravan's gates were under public guard. Kilul's warehouses had been sealed. Inventories had begun. Grain was being measured for redistribution under council authority. Couriers had gone east and south and north carrying authenticated copies of the records to every council and commander touched by Kilul's web. The machine was not dead yet. Such machines do not die in a day. But the great central gear had cracked. And still Orhan did not rest. He went to the willow shade where Tarhin lay on blankets, stripped to the waist, while physicians stitched the wound beneath his collar. The blade had missed the great vessels by the width of a prayer. Had it gone a finger deeper, Daravan would have become for Orhan a city forever haunted by a ghost at his side. Tarhin was awake. That disappointed me, Tarhin said through clenched teeth, as a physician threaded curved needle through torn flesh. Orhan knelt. What did? Şahinşah, I had imagined him taller. Despite everything, despite smoke and blood and the fatigue that had hollowed him to the bone, Orhan laughed once. A broken laugh, brief and rough, but real. The physician frowned at them both, as if humor were an infection that endangered his work. You nearly died, Orhan said. Tarhin stared up through willow leaves at the slice of sky beyond. Nearly is a wide country. I have camped there before. Orhan's voice softened. Do not return there quickly. Tarhin turned his head. In his eyes there was pain, yes, and weariness beyond measure, but also the old, unspent iron. Not while you still need arrows caught. Orhan clasped his forearm. The grip held a moment longer than usual, because some truths are too great for speech and would only be diminished by it. As evening came, Daravan changed again, not into celebration. Celebration would have been obscene. Too much ash still floated in the air. Too many names had been spoken in the square with tears behind them. Too many crimes had surfaced for joy to be clean. What settled over the city instead was something rarer, relief mixed with mourning. The strange stillness of a people who realize that the thing they had half suspected and half dreaded is real, and that because it is real, it can at last be addressed. Fires were lit in braziers. Bread was distributed in the square, not as alms from a merchant, but from seized grain under public order. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Men broke loaves and passed them to strangers. Women carried bowls to the witnesses who had traveled from distant villages. Children slept against their mothers' shoulders, while Qadis still read in the courthouse by lamplight. Orhan stood on the courthouse roof at dusk with Faladios and looked over the city. It is not finished, Faladios said. No, Orhan answered. There will be others, other Kiluls, other men above him as he claimed, other routes, other ledgers. Yes. Faladios looked west, where the last light lay over the plain like a sheet of beaten copper. Then what have we done? Orhan was silent for a long while. We have interrupted inheritance, he said at last. We have broken the custom of silence. The next thief will know he can be named. The next ruler will know records survive fire. The next village will know it may speak and be heard. Perhaps the wheel does not stop, but a spoke has been shattered. Sometimes that is how great things begin. Faladios absorbed that and nodded. Below them, in the square, Jakarta Sahib supervised the ceiling of another warehouse. Demirhan Khan posted archers on the city walls, not against citizens, but against whatever remnants of Kilul's network might try to strike from outside. Zarkan arrived at sunset from the eastern passes with news that Mustafa had broken Al-Aliaddin Sahib's final caravans and scattered his hired men. Another courier came from the south. Altadin Sahib had secured full council support. Kilul's properties in 3 provinces were under seizure. A third rider reported from the fortress that Yaqid had heard of Şahinşah's recapture and had asked to testify publicly against the machine he once served. The web was tearing in every direction. And yet, even there, even in that hour when law held and the city breathed and men allowed themselves the dangerous luxury of imagining an end, Orhan felt the old instinct in his bones. the sense that history does not like clean conclusions, that evil, cornered, always leaves one hand hidden. The messenger arrived after nightfall. He was not one of theirs. He wore sea salt on his cloak, and his boots were caked not with plain dust, but with the white crust of dried marsh. He came under escort from the western gate, carrying a tube of oiled leather sealed in blue wax. The seal was broken and foreign to most in the room, but Palladios recognized it before the messenger had even knelt. "The western ports," he said. Orhan took the tube and unrolled the thin parchment inside. The message was brief, written in a cipher hand but already translated by the frightened dockmaster who had intercepted it. Cargo rerouted, principal account shifted by sea, secondary partners proceeding with winter loans, await the arrival of the widow from the north with imperial guarantee. Orhan read it twice. "The widow," Palladios said quietly. Orhan looked up. "Who?" Palladios's face had gone very still. "Not a widow of mourning, a title. Among the western ports they call her that because wherever her ships make harbor, one ruler soon buries another. She is not merchant alone. She brokers crowns, loans cities, sells fleets. If Killil was a gear, as he claimed, then she may be one of the hands that turns the wheel." The room seemed to contract around those words, not from fear alone, though fear was part of it, from recognition. The campaign they had fought, the grain, the roads, the mercenaries, the bribed judges, the bought commanders, this had never been merely provincial corruption. It had been a branch of something wider, colder, more patient. A sea-born power now turning its gaze inland because one of its agents had fallen. Orhan, pale but sitting now against cushions, heard it and let out a slow breath. "So, another road." Orhan rolled the parchment and held it in his fist. "Yes," he said, "another road." He went back to the roof before midnight. Alone this time, Daravan lay quiet beneath him, quieter than any city with so many fresh wounds had a right to be. In the square, braziers burned low. On the far streets, patrols moved with lanterns. Somewhere a child cried in sleep, then settled. Somewhere a muezzin rehearsed tomorrow's call under his breath. Somewhere behind thick stone walls, Killil and Şahinşah sat separately in guarded rooms, each alone for perhaps the first honest hour in years. Orhan looked west, where the darkness hid the sea. He thought of the widow from the north, of ships moving under winter cloud, of gold crossing water while men on land buried sons and counted grain. He thought of Yakid still waiting testimony, of Mustafa in the east, Altadin in the south, Jakarta walking the long path back from betrayal, Palladios sharpening not only his sword, but his understanding of the larger game. He thought of Turhan under bandages below, still alive by Allah's measure and no physician's wisdom. Then he placed both hands on the cold stone parapet and bowed his head. "O Allah," he whispered into the sleeping city, "you have brought us through fire without letting us become only fire. You have shown us rot without letting us despair of the root. If this road leads farther than we knew, then enlarge our strength. If the sea sends us new enemies, then keep our hearts from shrinking. Let justice not become vanity in us. Let victory not become appetite. Let us remember the hungry before we remember the proud." The wind off the western plain answered with no words, only chill. Below, a bell sounded once from the courthouse tower, then again, not alarm, the turning of the watch. Orhan lifted his head. Far out in the darkness, beyond Daravan, beyond the roads and plains, and court warrants and burning archives, beyond even the reach of horsemen who still believed all wars were decided on land, a ship was coming. And on that ship, whether by title or truth, rode the next shadow, not the scattered, irregular rhythm of scouts or messengers, not the tired, stumbling cadence of exhausted riders moving at the edge of endurance. This was a force moving with purpose, a column advancing in formation, disciplined enough to keep its pace steady, desperate enough to drive its horses beyond what mercy would allow. The sound rolled across the plain in waves, growing louder with each passing moment, and it carried with it the particular weight of inevitability, the knowledge that what had been coming for days was now here, and there would be no more delays, no more negotiations with time, no more bargains to be struck with the dawn. Orhan stood in the central square of Daravan with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed on the eastern gate. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had not moved from this spot in over an hour, and the stillness of his body was not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of a man who had gathered all his strength into a single point and held it there, balanced on the edge of action. Around him, the square had filled again, not with the chaotic press of a mob, but with the ordered presence of a people who had made a decision and were prepared to stand by it. They lined the edges of the square in rows that reached back into the side streets and up the steps of the mosque, and along the rooftops where children sat with their legs dangling over the parapets, silent now, watching with the wide, unblinking eyes of those who sense that history is being made and do not yet understand the cost of it. Faladios stood to Orhan's right, his face drawn and pale in the morning light, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, though he had given strict orders that no blade was to be drawn unless the square was invaded. Demirhan stood to Orhan's left with his archers positioned along the rooftops and in the upper windows of the surrounding buildings, not with arrows nocked, but with bows in hand, ready, disciplined, their eyes fixed on the eastern gate with the patient alertness of men who had learned that the difference between restraint and slaughter was often measured in the space between one breath and the next. And beyond them, in the streets and alleys and open spaces of the city, Orhan's force waited, not as an army preparing for battle, but as a presence, a reminder that the people of Daravan were not alone, that the truth they had chosen to defend had protectors, that the man who rode toward them with 60 desperate followers would find not a frightened population to intimidate, but a community that had found its courage and would not surrender it. Then the eastern gate opened. Not because anyone had ordered it opened. The city guards had abandoned their posts at the first sound of the approaching hooves, stepping back from the gate and melting into the crowd, unwilling to be the first obstacle placed between Şahinşah and the square. The gate swung inward on its ancient hinges, and through the opening came the riders. Şahinşah was at their head. He rode a black horse that was lathered and trembling, its flanks streaked with foam and blood where the spurs had driven too deep, its eyes rolling white with exhaustion and terror. Şahinşah himself was no better. His armor was dented and scratched, his cloak torn, his face hollowed by days without sleep and nights spent riding through darkness with the knowledge that every mile behind him was lost ground and every mile ahead was uncertain. His beard was matted, his hair wild beneath his helm, and his eyes burned with the feverish light of a man who has gambled everything on a single throw and sees the dice turning against him. Behind him came his 60 men, or what remained of them. They were a ragged collection of mercenaries and loyalists and desperate men who had nowhere else to go, their horses stumbling, their weapons held with the loose grip of exhaustion, their faces showing the particular blankness that comes when the body has gone beyond its limits, and the mind has retreated into some private corner where pain cannot follow. They rode into Daravan not as conquerors, but as fugitives, and the city received them with silence. Şahinşah reined in his horse at the edge of the central square. He looked around at the faces that surrounded him, at the rows of citizens standing shoulder to shoulder, at the archers on the rooftops, at Orhan Sahib waiting beside the fountain with his hands still clasped behind his back, and for the first time since his escape from the fortress, the certainty drained from his expression. He saw what he had not expected to see, not fear, not submission, not the cringing deference of a population accustomed to being ruled by force. He saw resolve, he saw judgment, he saw the face of a people who had learned the truth about him and had decided that the truth was more powerful than his sword. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the labored breathing of Şahinşah's horse, the distant murmur of the wind through the streets, and the soft, collective exhalation of thousands of people holding their breath at once. Then Şahinşah laughed. It was a broken sound, harsh and brittle, the laugh of a man who has run out of options and is trying to convince himself that the situation is still under his control. He dismounted with difficulty, his legs nearly giving way beneath him as his feet touched the ground, and he took a step forward into the square. Orhan Sahib, he said, his voice was hoarse, raw from days of shouting orders and breathing dust and smoke, So this is where you hide, behind the skirts of women and the prayers of old men, behind the walls of a city that has no stomach for war. Orhan did not move. He did not raise his voice. When he spoke, his words carried across the square with the quiet authority of a man who has nothing to prove and nothing to fear. I do not hide, Şahinşah. I stand, as I have always stood, in the open, in the light, where truth can be seen and lies cannot survive. You have ridden hard to reach this place, and now that you are here, tell me what you have come to do. Will you draw your sword and spill blood in a city full of innocent people? Will you add their deaths to the ledger of your crimes and call it victory? Or will you face what you have done and accept the judgment that awaits you? Şahinşah's hand went to the hilt of his sword. The movement was instinctive, automatic, the reflex of a man who had spent his entire life solving problems with steel. But he did not draw it. His fingers tightened around the hilt and then loosened again, as though even his own body had begun to doubt the wisdom of the path he had chosen. You speak of judgment, he said, but who will judge me? You, the people of this city, a merchant's clerk with a ledger and a list of numbers. I am Şahinşah. I have ruled these lands for 20 years. I have made decisions that lesser men could not make. I have taken lives that needed to be taken and preserved lives that deserved to be preserved. You call it corruption. I call it governance. Orhan took a step forward. The crowd held its breath. You call theft governance. You call famine commerce. You call the sale of weapons to both sides of a war strategy. You have confused power with righteousness for so long that you no longer know the difference between them. But the people of Daravan know the difference. They have seen the documents. They have heard the testimony of those you starved and those you conscripted and those you betrayed. They have weighed your deeds against your words, and they have found you wanting. Şahinşah's eyes flickered toward the crowd. He saw the faces turn toward him, not with fear, but with condemnation. He saw the woman whose son had not returned from the war, standing near the front with tears on her cheeks and fire in her eyes. He saw the old farmer whose livestock had been taken, the young man who had deserted his army, the witnesses from Ashkara whose stories had traveled from village to village until they had reached this square and taken root in the hearts of everyone who heard them. And for the first time, Şahinşah looked afraid. Not of death he had faced before and would face again without flinching. He was afraid of something worse than death. He was afraid of irrelevance, of being stripped of the titles and the honors and the carefully constructed narrative that had sustained him for decades. He was afraid of standing before the people he had ruled and seeing in their eyes not respect or fear, but the simple, devastating recognition that he was nothing more than a man who had sold their suffering for gold. He drew his sword. The sound of steel leaving the sheath was sharp and final, and it sent a ripple of tension through the square. Demirhan's archers shifted on the rooftops, their bows coming up a fraction of an inch, their fingers tightening on the strings. Faladios stepped forward, placing himself between Orhan and Şahinşah, his own hand moving to his weapon. But Orhan raised a hand, and the movement was enough to stop them all. If you draw your sword here, he said, his voice still calm, still controlled, you will die here, not by my hand, by the hands of the people you have betrayed. Look around you, Şahinşah. Do you see an army? Do you see soldiers waiting to die for your cause? You see citizens, you see families. You see men and women who have chosen truth over fear and who will not allow you to turn their city into a battlefield to save your pride. Şahinşah's sword trembled in his hand. His eyes moved from Orhan to the crowd to the rooftops where the archers waited, and the weight of his situation settled on him with the crushing force of a mountain falling from the sky. He was surrounded. He was outnumbered. He was exhausted. And the cause he had fought for had dissolved around him like mist in the morning sun, leaving nothing behind but the cold, hard reality of what he had done. Then a voice called out from the eastern gate. Not Şahinşah's voice, not Orhan's voice, a voice that carried the rough edge of dust and distance and days of riding without rest. Make way. The crowd parted as though pushed by an invisible hand, and through the opening came Orhan. He rode at the head of 20 men, but they were not the same 20 men who had left with him 2 days ago. They were fewer now, their horses stumbling with exhaustion, their armor battered and bloodied, their faces showing the marks of hard riding and harder fighting. Orhan himself was slumped in his saddle, one arm hanging useless at his side, his cloak torn to reveal a bandage wrapped around his ribs that was already dark with blood. But his eyes were clear, his gaze was steady. And when he saw Orhan standing in the square, a look of relief passed across his face, so profound, it seemed to age him 10 years in an instant. He reined in his horse beside the fountain and dismounted with a grimace of pain that he did not try to hide. He walked to Orhan's side and stood there for a moment, breathing hard, gathering the strength to speak. "I found him," Orhan said, his voice rough with dust and exhaustion. "I harried him as long as I could. I burned the bridges, I poisoned the wells, I made every mile cost him blood, but he was faster than I thought. He had fresh horses, Killul's horses, hidden in a depot north of the old road. He broke through my line yesterday at sunset." Orhan looked at Orhan, at the blood on his bandages, at the exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and felt something in his chest tighten until it was hard to breathe. "You should not have come," he said. Orhan almost smiled. The expression was small and fleeting, but it was there. "You gave me an order," he said, "to come back alive. I am trying to obey." Then his gaze shifted to Şahinşah, who stood with his sword still drawn, his face pale, his eyes darting between Orhan and the crowd that surrounded him. "But I bring worse news," Orhan continued. "Killul is gone. He fled the city last night. His mercenaries tried to cover his escape, but they were too late. He took his gold, his ledgers, and what remained of his documents. He rides north, through the Ashkara forest, toward the mountain passes beyond Al-Aliaddin's territory." The words hit the square like a physical blow. Killul gone. The merchant prince who had orchestrated the war, who had profited from every death and every famine and every betrayal, had slipped through their fingers and was fleeing into the mountains with the evidence of his crimes and the wealth that had bought them. Orhan felt the moment tilt beneath him, the careful balance he had maintained for days shifting toward something darker, something more dangerous. If Killul escaped into the mountains, he would find new allies. He would buy new mercenaries. He would rebuild his network in the shadows beyond the reach of law and justice, and the war that they had fought so hard to end would begin again in a different form, with different names and different faces, but the same hunger for profit driving it forward. But even as the despair threatened to rise in him, Orhan felt something else, something that had been there all along, beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the weight of responsibility that had pressed down on him for so long. It was the same thing that had sustained him through every battle and every march and every sleepless night. Faith. Not faith in victory, not faith in his own strength, faith in the truth, faith in the people who stood around him now, who had chosen justice over fear and who had proven, in this square, in this moment, that the darkness could be pushed back by the simple act of refusing to accept it. He turned to Şahinşah. "Your master is gone," he said. "The man who paid you to betray your own people has abandoned you. The gold that bought your loyalty is riding north into the mountains, and you are left here with nothing but the consequences of your choices. But you still have a choice to make." Şahinşah stared at him, his sword hanging heavy in his hand. "What choice?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper. "The choice between continuing a war that is already lost and accepting responsibility for what you have done. The choice between dying in this square with a sword in your hand and living long enough to face the judgment of the people you ruled. The choice between being remembered as a tyrant who profited from suffering and being remembered as a man who, at the end, found the courage to tell the truth." Şahinşah looked at the sword in his hand. He looked at the crowd around him. He looked at Orhan, at Turhan, at Faladios, at the faces of the people who had once feared him, and now looked at him with something that was not fear but something harder, more final. And slowly, with the careful deliberation of a man laying down a burden he had carried for too long, he lowered his sword. The blade touched the ground with a soft, metallic sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the square. Şahinşah released the hilt and let his arm fall to his side, and for the first time in years, the weight of his own choices appeared fully on his face, naked and unhidden. "I am tired," he said, "so tired." Orhan stepped forward and took the sword from the ground. He did not keep it. He handed it to Turhan, who received it with a nod and secured it to his saddle. Then rest, Orhan said, rest, and face what comes next with the dignity that remains to you. The war is not over, Killil still lives, the mountain passes still wait, and there are other men like you, other merchants, other tyrants, other voices whispering in the darkness that profit is more important than people. He turned to the crowd, to the people of Daravan who had stood with him in the square and proven that truth could still find a home in the world. But today, in this place, we have taken a step forward. Today we have shown that a people who know the truth cannot be ruled by lies. Today we have shown that justice does not require an army, only the courage to speak and the willingness to listen. He looked north, toward the mountains where Killil was fleeing, toward the passes where the next battle would be fought, toward the long road that still stretched ahead of them into darkness and uncertainty. And tomorrow, he said, we ride north. The crowd did not cheer. They did not shout. They stood in silence, and in that silence was something more powerful than any victory cry. It was the sound of a people choosing to continue, to endure, to carry the burden of justice one more mile, one more day, one more battle, until the last merchant prince had been stripped of his gold, and the last tyrant had been stripped of his power, and the children of Ashkara could sleep through the night without dreaming of hunger. Orhan mounted his horse. Tarhan mounted beside him, wincing with pain but refusing to show weakness. Faladios and Demir Khan and the rest of his commanders formed up around them, and together they turned their horses toward the northern gate, toward the mountains, toward the war that was not over and the reckoning that was still to come. Behind them, the people of Daravan watched them go, and in their eyes was the same light that had burned in Orhan's heart since the first night of this long campaign. The light of faith, the light of truth, the light that no darkness could extinguish, no betrayal could dim, no merchant's gold could buy. And as they rode north into the dawn, the sound of their hooves on the road was like a promise. A promise that the wheel would turn, and this time it would turn toward justice. A promise that the war would end, not in the counting houses of merchants, but in the hearts of people who refused to be deceived. A promise that the story, though unfinished, was still being written, and that the final chapter, whenever it came, would belong not to the tyrants and the thieves, but to those who had the courage to stand in the light and speak the truth. The mountains waited ahead, dark and vast and full of shadows. But Orhan Sahib rode toward them without fear, and behind him rode the living proof that darkness, no matter how deep, could never conquer the light.